This time we're ready to call the Finance and Operations Committee to order. We'll give everybody a second to be seated.
Very nice to meet you. Steve, how are you today?
Great to see everybody here. I feel a little more comfortable up here after last month. I've done it once, so I'm still quite a rookie, but we'll get going. We do have a lot on the agenda today. I'm looking, a couple people are gone, but we do have a quorum. I think we might as well get started. We're going to try to get through it on a timely basis. Our first item is the President's recommended 6-year capital plan and the 2018 state capital request. I know Vice President Burnett, Vice President Kramer, and it looks like Vice President Burleson is at the table. So I'll let you people take it away.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, and good morning, members of the board and our gathered folks today. This is the second of two presentations of our 6-year capital plan and the state capital request. I'll spend just a couple of slides recapping the 6-year plan, but primarily we will focus today on the state request. Waiting for our slide deck to come up here. There we go. So there are two primary pieces, as we talked last time, that inform a 6-year capital plan. First and foremost are mission priorities. These are gathered and prioritized by the Provost, the Vice President for Research, and the Vice President for Health Sciences. We also collect and analyze our facility priorities. As you know, our projected 10-year deferred capital renewal need is about $4.2 billion. The Capital Strategy Group looks at both of these priority areas and puts together a draft 6-year capital plan, which the President reviews and approves for submission to this board. We shared last month that the proposed 6-year capital plan places a strong emphasis on protecting and preserving what we already have. There is very limited new projects in this plan, and that which is new is paid for with philanthropic giving at the Arboretum. The priorities you see here are the same we have had for the past few years. I went through these with you last month, and they are presented here one more time as a reminder of why some things are in the plan and others are not. So these are the priorities with which we look at capital requests throughout the system. The state is not just an important source of our operations and maintenance funding, they are also our most important partner and largest source of funds for capital projects, coming in at just shy of 70% of all capital. The pace of renewal in our current model ebbs and flows with the amount of bonding proceeds appropriated by the state. Vice President Kramer.
Thank you. Thank you, Senior Vice President Burnett. Mr. Chair, members, as you know, creating the bonding request is a combination of understanding not only the state's historical outlook on finances, but the state's current financial outlook and the legislature's direction. And go ahead, Mike. We have talked extensively with the legislative leadership. We'll go to the next slide. And we understand that there is an increased priority, as there has been for some time, but I would say now more important than ever, that we invest in and maintain our existing infrastructure, and that we look to maximize our asset preservation and conversion of outdated space into student success areas. Next slide. To that end, we have boiled down our requests to, and you have seen this, we've just made a recent change, 3 principal priorities. And I'm going to go over each one of these in more detail, but I'd like to ask President Kaler to comment on the Glensheen Renewal Challenge Initiative.
Mr. Chair.
President Kaler.
Members of the committee, thank you. As you see, we have added a 4th item, which is a $4 million appropriation in support of a renovation of Glensheen. We'll use this appropriation to create the Glensheen Renewal Challenge, which will be a program to match 1-for-1 donations to Glensheen. This initiative is important for renewal of the facility, and you may know that about a year ago I convened the Glensheen Options Task Force to determine how to preserve this historic asset. The task force has members from the university's Twin Cities campus, UMD, the City of Duluth, St. Louis County, and the University of Minnesota Foundation, and we believe this appropriation that we are requesting will provide good fuel for their work. Thank you.
Before we turn it back to Vice President Kramer, just a note, that column, the $4 million in this challenge initiative for the board's understanding would be donations that would not be university resources. It would be donations that would match the state bonding request. So there's a little bit of a misnomer in that column as we added that. Vice President Kramer.
Thank you. Vice President Kramer, if you want to continue.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chair, members, I mentioned that HEAPR is our principal request with a $200 million ask. You are well aware that we have an extensive backlog. Our capital planning group has prioritized the level of investment that we need, and we've looked at both the historical aspect of HEAPR requests, but also an even bonding year and the potential for a slightly greater ask. We're well aware that by asking for a larger number, historically the state has reduced that commensurate with other requests, including Minnesota State colleges and universities. And I'm not going to go through the individual pictures, but you're aware that HEAPR dollars are used to maintain maintain and fix existing infrastructure. Next slide. We also have the Greater Minnesota Academic Renewal. This is for the Morris, Crookston, and Duluth campuses. It is an opportunity to take outdated space that is not eligible for HEAPR dollars. So HEAPR must maintain the current use of a space. In this particular case, we have existing space that is no longer needed. We reprioritize that for student investment, so student spaces, learning, academic, et cetera. Next slide. You're well aware that Pillsbury on this campus has been a priority for some time. We have this listed as our third choice. Recently, the opening of the Tate Physics Building has allowed a significant percentage of the staff inside Pillsbury to move to the brand new structure, and it is our intent that ultimately the English department would occupy Pillsbury. This renovation would be very similar to Northrop Auditorium, where the exterior of the building would be maintained, but the interior, which is by and large wood, would be completely removed. We would rebuild the building from the inside out. And finally, last one, Glensheen. If there's a picture that qualifies for HEAPR investment, it may very well be the one of the boiler here, which I think is circa early 1910. Clearly requires some work, but the Glensheen Mansion is a state asset. It is a University of Minnesota system asset and provides an opportunity for us, working with the task force that the President put together, to seek and hopefully find a long-term solution for the system. Next slide. Mr. Chair, members, happy to entertain any questions, as I know SVP Burnett is as well.
Okay. I think maybe the best way to proceed, members of the board, you have a resolution in front of you that is slightly different than you saw in your packets. It adds the Glensheen request to it, and the docket item summary, a little updated, also adds the Glensheen challenge initiative to it. My suggestion would be if somebody would so move, we'll get the motion on the table, and then if we want to ask questions or discuss it, we can do that.
So moved.
Second.
And so moved in a second. I guess that was quick. So we are ready for discussion at this time. Is there any discussion on the capital? Regent Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. In regard to the Glensheen issue, and I've had some discussions with various people, including Representative Dean Erdahl, who is my neighbor back out west in this regard. My question to you, Mr. President or Mr. Bertelsen, does the city of Duluth or St. Louis County have a local option sales tax that could be part of this contribution on this challenge grant? Or Mr. Burnett?
Vice President Kramer.
Vice President Kramer.
Mr. Chair, Regent Johnson, they may or may not have, and I apologize, I don't know if Duluth has a local option sales tax. I would suggest, though, that Mayor Larson would not be inclined to use their local sales tax for Glensheen. As you may be aware, and I've simply read this and follow it, they are involved in some extensive infrastructure improvements in the city, primarily their street and public works system.
Well, Mr. Chairman?
Regent Johnson.
And I respect the mayor's desire and wishes and the city council, but I think about our friends at Rochester who have used local option sales tax monies over the years for a number of projects, you know, from flood control to buildings to real estate purchases, and perhaps it's something that the Duluth delegation might look at in the upcoming legislative session, because I believe the local option sales tax, the way it works, the legislature gives a local jurisdiction the opportunity, and then the local citizens vote on it. So it's local control. And my point is, yes, the Glensheen is a asset of the University of Minnesota. At the same time, it has economic commercial, whatever benefit to that region. And I'm not saying I'm not for it. I just want to have as many partners in this Glensheen going forward as we possibly can, so it doesn't simply fall on the university. I understand the operations of it, but we also, the issue is the capital formation, and I think all in we could get something of $35 million to bring Glensheen up to safety and full use. So that's why I bring up the issue of some kind of a funding, and local option sales tax can be one of those vehicles. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Regent Johnson. Regent Sviggum, did you have something to add? Regent Sviggum?
Not to the local option sales tax.
Okay, but to the
To the
resolution, fine.
members, as I look at this request that's before us right now, I have a number of concerns, and I'll just lay them out. I will probably try to offer some of them tomorrow in an amendment to the capital plan here, just to make you aware and to give you a little briefing. Mr. President, thank you for listening, and you have been listening to our legislators. Thank you very, very much. And Matt and Brian, you've done a great job of listening. Mr. Regent Sue and I have had a number of conversations regarding Glensheen. I think in regards to what you have come forward with, Glensheen, and I'm sorry we could not talk yesterday. I was doing lutefisk, Mr. President, all day long.
That's important.
That's important. I think we've gone further than we need to in responding to a legislative request of us. I don't think Glensheen is part of our mission as the University of Minnesota, point blank. It's not part of our mission. But in listening to legislators, including the chair, they'd like to have an inkle of Glensheen being in our request so that they can at least talk about it and put it in their priorities if they'd like to. Requesting $4 million, Mr. Kramer, is more than an inkle. It's much more. I have a different way of going about it. Maybe not as good, maybe not as smart, but I have a different way of going about it, and that would be to list, I have an amendment being drafted right now for tomorrow, to list some of our HEAPR projects that we would be requesting in the $200 million, and to put Glensheen in that listing. Not necessarily putting $4 million next to it, but at least having the word Glensheen in there so that the legislators can at least speak about it. I think we are wrong by putting $4 million in there. I think it's not our mission. It's not, and I know we own it. I wish I could go back 30 years ago and not accept it, but it's not there. Secondly, and I think I inkled this in our last September meeting, I think we're requesting too much, members of the legislature. It's not, maybe I could ask Mr. Chairman, Mr. Kramer, when's the last time the university received $238 million in the bonding bill?
Mr. Kramer.
Mr. Chair, Regents Regan, I don't believe the university has ever received $238 million in a state bonding bill.
Mr. Kramer, when's the last time the university has received $200 million in the bonding bill?
President Kramer.
Mr. Chair, Regents Regan, I would have to check. I don't know on that
The
answer.
answer is no. How about $175 million? You see where I'm going, members? And I don't need to put Mr. Kramer on the spot. The fact is that the bonding bill, if there is a bonding bill, and we don't even know that there will be, it's going to be less than $1 billion. It's going to be $800 million of GO bonds. We're average going to get somewhere between 10 and 15%. That's history. Senator Johnson, go back. That's history. That's exactly where we're going to be. I think we should be requesting $150 million of HEAPR and be realistic and direct and honest with the legislature and not be like Minshew and ask for more of the sky when we know we're going to get the moon, if there is even a moon, if there is even a bonding bill. And it's just where I'm at, members. You can be in completely different places, but I want to be upfront and honest with you as well as with our members of the legislature. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Sviggum. Regent Rocha has questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Am I limited to questions, or can I make a comment?
You can make comments also.
I appreciate Regent Svigum's perspective. I take a bit of a different approach, I think actually on both points. First, I'll talk a second about Glensheen. It is certainly a fair position that Glensheen is not a typical core mission asset, but we have an awful lot that are not. We have assets that seat 50,000 people that many in the state would suggest aren't necessarily core to the mission. But I actually think that Glensheen has many elements that are a part of our mission. I know that we've had a very long relationship with the facility. This is the same conversation that we've had in prior days on the board. And to the extent that we had made the investment then, it would have been a lot less expensive, and we would have had that sort of functional use of a higher quality facility over all that period. But the financial times did not necessarily provide that. But I like the fact that the facility is somewhat of a living laboratory, that you do have student activity on the premises, you have research that's being conducted on the premises. It may not be the volume that we will see in other facilities in terms of the number of students that you would run through or the volume of the research, but nonetheless, I think that is valuable. I also think that as an outreach feature, which is one of the legs of our mission accomplishment, is the outreach and extension component of the university. Glensheen has always been a great asset for us. The number of people, I won't sing its praises. There are others that would be much better about doing that, for the number of folks that make their way through that, all as somewhat of a front door for the university, and then also just in terms of it being an asset that is used by the university, particularly the campus, for events and relationships with the donors and other important folks. So I mean, to me, I don't think we can really say that it's not part of our mission. I think we can say that maybe there are sort of higher payoff. I don't think so. I think that it actually does, for the money and for the presence that it provides the university. I actually think it's a pretty significant asset to the university, and so I am more comfortable with the request, I believe, than you are. But I certainly respect your position and appreciate you articulating it to the board. As to the total dollar amount, and again, I certainly have no measurable capacity to talk about legislative affairs to the extent that you can. I can only talk about it from the other side. And as I think Mr. Kramer indicated a bit ago, when the university has tried to come in with a more reserved approach on the lines that you're describing, we saw ourselves effectively being reduced in terms of the overall distribution. And I think there's a human nature component to it. I think that making a request that shows the range of needs that we have gives the legislature the ability then to look at it and make an evaluation of how important those needs are compared to all of the other entities that are going to be coming forward making similar requests. Last thing I'll say, Mr. Chair, thanks for your indulgence here, is that I very much appreciate that this is about maintaining and improving what we have, and that it's not building new buildings. As I've said before, I was surprised returning to the board to see just how much we've built when I expected us to be less space-based after 20 years, not more. And so the idea that we are focusing on improving what we have, I think that's good economic stewardship for the university, and so I think it's a reasonable request, and I'm going to support it.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. We have a couple more people that want to speak, and if we can probably be brief on them, but we'll get going with the resolution. Regent Beeson, you're going to pass. Regent McMillan.
I'll pass.
You'll pass. Regent Regan.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And to respond to my friend Regent Rocha, and I do appreciate where you're coming from. And if the request of this board becomes $238 million, I will be there with a cheerleading sign and be there to support that. I don't think it's the wisest way to go, very, very honestly, and having sat in this chair as well as another chair. Just a couple of quick responses. First of all, with minimal research, and you know I only do minimal research, but it's minimal research that I think has been shared with Mr. Brunette and Mr. Sue and maybe Mr. McMillan as well. I do not believe there are any classes from UMD that have been held at Glensheen. In fact, to the best of my ability in reading a memo, the best that happens is that we have students at UMD who get to work at events that take place at Glensheen. At least I think that is what was told to me and what I read in a memo. And Regents Rocha, I understand that this board previous years has had maybe discussions about Glensheen, whether it should be considered or not, but this board in its wisdom in previous years and decades has been so wise as to not put Glensheen on our 6-year capital plan list.
Thank you, Regent Regan. Regent McMillan, did you want to speak this time?
Yes, thank you, Chair Anderson. I think we need to have an open mind and a good appreciation for what is going on up at Glensheen, and it isn't a core mission asset in the sense that you'd think of laboratories and classrooms, but the outreach mission there is clear and compelling. 120,000 people going through there a year, and I don't have that many assets where we get that many members of the general public. You've got it 10 blocks down the hill from the Large Lakes Observatory, you know, the blue herons across the harbors, the research limnology opportunities. You got one of the only cold weather gardens on the entire system, comprising close to an acre of the grounds up there, enlarging bee research station, art history, outdoor recreation, hospitality. There's a lot of things going on there, and I'm not trying to do a sales pitch for it. I just think when we think about mission, it isn't only a place where there's a lab hood and a chemistry experiment going on, or a classroom with 42 desks in it. It is it's 8 acres of land that is pretty unique and situated right in the heart of a key part of our system. So just be open and learning about mission. That would be my sense here. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent McMillan. President Kaler was next on my agenda here.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Just a couple of points. First, to recognize that State Representative Jen Schultz is in the audience, and I know she has a keen interest in Glensheen. Secondly, just a little perspective to Regent Swigham's very good observations. Historically, we receive about between 13 and 14%, whatever the bonding bill is, and that assumes there is a bonding bill, of course, which is a big assumption. And so if you make the assumption of $1 billion for the sake of argument, that's $140 million. Our view is that if we ask for $140 million, we're not going to get $140 million. That's just sort of, in my minuscule experience compared to Regent Swigham's, what would happen. And if we were honest about what we needed for HEPR, we'd ask for $3 billion, which is what we need, and we're not going to get that either. So, you know, there we are. So that's our thinking around the overall number. With respect to Glensheen, we've adopted this strategy rather than as you would inkle, which I actually didn't know was a word, but inkle, in our HEPR, is that I just don't want to open a conversation with our legislators that sets political priorities within an overall HEPR conversation. We have a very robust strategy system-wide for where we need to apply HEPR dollars. And that list can move depending on the amount that we get, because, you know, if we can do a little bit here and move forward, we'll do it. If we have more resources, we might do a lot in a different venue. So we need to be flexible, and I really don't want to start a conversation where certain elements in the HEPR list become immune to adjustment because of a political influence. So I'd like to keep HEPR as a pure need-driven allocation to the university, and if there are elements that are valuable to the public, to particular locations, we'll call them out, we'll put them up, and we'll let the legislature take action on them as they see appropriate. So that's just a little perspective on our thinking about why we've done it this way.
Thank you, President Kaler. Regent Beeson did want to speak now?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Regent Regan, for raising this. I think it's a healthy conversation. If we were to reinvent the world, Minnesota Historical Society would own this building. I think, and maybe someday that will happen. But we do own it, and this is a lesson about accepting gifts look at Umore Park. Be extremely careful about accepting gifts going forward. This is a state asset, even though we own it, and it is a community asset. So I think it's appropriate, the way that you've structured this, to ask the community to put in $4 million and to ask the state to put in $4 million. And there is some return. There's some the improvements that go towards some revenue generating parts of the building, so I think we'll get some return on the money. As relates to the overall request, I go back to Regent Roche's comment at last meeting that we don't want to be penalized for coming in with a lower ask than would our counterparts. And but you're right, Regents Regan. It's not. We're not going to get the full $200 million, and I also agree with you on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Regent Lucas.
Thank you, Chair. I support the proposal for Glensheen, but my only regret is that I had hoped to send over a very clean request this year that would emphasize our support for Pillsbury Hall, which has been waiting in line for so long.
Thank you, Regent Lucas. I think we've heard from everybody who wants to be heard. So we do have a motion and a second on the table for the resolution related to the 6-year capital plan and 2018 state capital request. It is the motion that has 4 specific items. The resolution doesn't actually say that, but that's what the totals go to. So at this time, I'm going to call the question. All those in favor of the resolution signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Motion passes. Okay, we're going to go on to our second item. Thank you, Vice President Burleson, Vice President Kramer. And we're going to move on to our 2019 budget variables and levers, which is a review item. We're going to have Vice President Brian Burnett and Associate Vice President Julie Tonneson present this. This comes to us today as a goal of ours to try to get budget items up front faster before June. And we're going to hear what these, and we have Ms. Ewell there also, what these people have to say. And so here we go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Julie and I will, Associate Vice President Tonneson and I will tag team this presentation. But as you know, we're currently in fiscal year 18, so we're talking about the budget year that begins July 1 of next year. So we're 9 months out from the next annual budget for the university. And there's really 2 purposes for today's presentation. One is to bring forward the President's recommendation on our non-resident, non-reciprocity tuition rate proposal for review by the board. We will discuss this near the end of the presentation. The primary purpose today is to tee up the resource and expenditure variables that we need to discuss as we develop the FY19 budget. And we are hoping that this will be an opportunity for board members to identify priorities and issues that you would like to see addressed in the next year's budget.
Good morning. To set a framework really around this discussion, I just want to let you know the presentation goes about 20 minutes, so that will leave you 40 minutes plus to discuss the variables and the recommendation. To provide some context for the discussion within the overall budget development cycle, we wanted to share with you the touch points on the budget you have built into your meeting schedule for this year. It actually started last June when we reviewed the long-range financial plan with the Finance Committee. We do that periodically throughout the year, so you will see that again. That is a 6-year rolling estimate of revenues and expenditures, often, always, showing a gap between the two in the out years, and it's an opportunity for us in the budget each year to close that gap. So that's part of that financial plan. Then today, as Brian mentioned, our goal is to review with you some very high-level budget variables and assumptions and talk about priorities for FY19. We'll be back in December to do that again after you have thought about it a little bit more. And then we're back in March to talk about FY19 specific dollar amounts and variables that we can build into the framework. And we wrap it up with the President's recommended budget for 19 for review in May and action in June. As we begin to talk about the budget variables, we think it's important, I missed some arrows here, we think it's important to talk about what the budget is, to remind ourselves what it is and how we think about it for planning purposes. For the year we're currently in, the FY18 approved non-sponsored budget is a total of $3.1 billion. If you add in or incorporate the sponsored funds, it jumps to $3.7 billion, and if you add the internal sales, it actually is just under $4 billion for the current year. Within this non-sponsored pie, however, you may remember we've discussed the fact that not all revenue sources are, quote, green, that many of our funds are restricted in such a way that direct us to spend it on certain things or in certain areas. Other funds are related to auxiliary businesses, which set rates designed to raise revenues just to cover their associated costs. And then we have other unrestricted funds at the unit level that vary depending on their activities. The only two truly discretionary funds available to tend to the general operations of the university as a whole are the O&M, state appropriation, and tuition. For this reason, the budget process focuses really highly on that $1.5 billion in funds from the state appropriation and tuition, building revenue estimates for those funds and determining the appropriate distribution of them. The other funds play a supporting role in this process, but we think about them differently and the decisions around them are different. So to help us in thinking about this budgeting process, we rely on something we call the budget framework, which we also have talked about. This is a very high set of assumptions and planning estimates that we use to balance the budget. It answers questions, again, around O&M and tuition about such questions as what should we plan for tuition revenue changes, what do we know about or assume for state appropriation changes, what do we want to plan for reallocation, on the spending side, what do we want to plan for compensation, facilities, and so forth. As we start to think about this, we have found it helpful in the past to share trends with you. So we want to do that first on the resource side, looking at the appropriation first and what we know about FY19. You've seen this chart before, but it helps to show that the level of state appropriations to the university do rise and fall with the economy. The high point in our appropriation in nominal terms was FY08 at about $709 million. It dropped during the recession and has, beginning in FY14, has trended back up again. So today we're at $683 million. That is $26 million below the peak unadjusted for inflation, or $150 million if you adjust for inflation. For FY19, we already know that the appropriation is going to drop by $10 million. It will be $673 next year, assuming that it doesn't get changed in this upcoming session. And just so you know that in the budget we approved for the current year, we did not create a spending tail. We spent that one-time non-recurring $10 million on an infusion into our system-wide R&R budget. So for framework purposes, the state money is flat. No new money for FY19. A second resource we include each year in the framework is reallocation. We've discussed before why we count budget cuts as a resource, which isn't necessarily intuitive to people. But it's because when revenues are stable or growing, the act of cutting expenses, which is what happens in a reallocation, results in freeing up existing resources to pay for or to redeploy to other priorities. So in a year like FY19, with no cuts in state funding, but also no increases, that reallocation combined with whatever we plan for tuition is what is necessary in order to pay for cost increases and investments. Over the years, the reallocation amounts we have brought forward to you in the budget have ranged from a low of 0.3% to just over 3%. The reallocations for 19 will again largely be focused on administrative reductions as we achieve the President's $90 million goal to reduce those over 6 years. But it is important to understand that they will also include mission-related spending reductions. It is becoming more difficult for units to find administrative reductions through increased efficiency in process or through restructuring. So we do anticipate there will be real program or service impacts on the table as we move forward in that exercise. Moving to tuition, our largest discretionary revenue source, prior to President Kaler's arrival at the university and during a period where there were significant budget cuts from the state, the average annual growth in tuition revenue was $50 million. Over the last 7 years, we've worked hard, and with the help of the state of Minnesota, to bend that curve so that the average annual growth in tuition revenue has dropped to $21 million. That includes revenue changes from all levels of students and changes in enrollment as well as rate. Breaking that down just a bit, the resident undergraduate tuition rates for each campus have been relatively stable over the last 6 years. You can see that FY 13, 14, and 15, the rates were flat across all campuses. Then in FY 16, they went up 1.5% on all campuses. FY 17, we had a mix, up 2.5% on the Twin Cities, but they were flat again for the other system campuses. And then this year, they went up 2% on the Twin Cities campus and 1% on the other system campuses. This results in that period with an average annual increase in these rates on the Twin Cities campus of just 1.2%, and for the other system campuses of 0.5%. The story is somewhat different on the non-resident rates. Crookston and Rochester, just to remind you, do not have a non-resident differential in their tuition structure. Morris reinstated their non-resident differential in FY 17, so they're working to transition that in. The Duluth campus has a non-resident differential, and the increases there have ranged anywhere from 2% to 5.5% over the last several, probably 5 years, to reflect their competitive position and their recruiting challenges. For the Twin Cities campus, however, the non-resident tuition rate has increased $7,700 over this 5-year period. Annually, that's anywhere from a 5.5% increase to a 12.5% increase this year. And although there's no chart for this here today, I need to mention that the increases in graduate and professional tuition rates have varied by program, and they do each year, but generally in the range of 0% to 3% over the last 5 years. Moving on to some trend information on the cost side. The single largest expense we have at the institution is salaries and benefits for our employees, always striving to comply with board policy goals related to competitive compensation within the constraint of resources we have available. You can see that in the years of significant appropriation reductions from the state of Minnesota, the university implemented salary freezes in FY 10 and in FY 12. The remaining years, we have planned increases of 2% or 2.5%. As you are aware, aside from what's required through collective bargaining agreements, the salary increases are done on a merit basis. So the averages across employees are what you see in the chart here, and across all employee groups. Based on information from Human Resources, these averages have been trending slightly below private industry, both locally and regionally, and slightly below our competitors in higher education. We provided a chart with further details on this in your docket materials on page 48. Additionally, we need to mention the cost of fringe benefits must be factored into the budget planning as well. Those fringe benefit rates for departments will increase for FY19. So the fringe costs that departments are going to have to pay next year are going up regardless of what we do with salaries. So even if there were a salary freeze, we have fringe cost increases. We provided an estimate of that in your docket materials on page 52, along with estimates of some of the other variables we've talked about here today, the revenue and the expense variables. Some other significant costs and investments in the non-personnel area, we think it's helpful to think about these in 3 big categories rather than sort of a line item look at this level of budget planning. And the first category is just generally facilities. The costs here range and vary by item and by year, and they depend on things sometimes external to the university, like the weather or the vendor amounts we have to pay to vendors for utilities. It depends also on our square footage. If we increase square footage, it depends on our debt service. A lot of things impact the facility costs each year. Operations is a second large category, and this is pretty dominated lately by technology costs, and these are, again, sometimes dependent on vendor contracts, sometimes dependent on our choice around what we do with our enterprise systems, our library systems, our academic technologies, the wireless network, and so forth. And finally, we have a category we call strategic choices. This involves a whole range of opportunities and obligations that we face to address either student financial aid needs or to address issues in the units to make them as successful as possible in achieving their goals and in thus fulfilling the mission of the university. So before turning to a discussion about all these variables I've mentioned, the revenue and the expense side, we've chosen to bring forward one specific budget recommendation now for review related to the non-resident tuition rate on the Twin Cities campus. And I'll turn to Brian to summarize this. Our Senior Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Julie. We do want to move now to the President's recommendation for your consideration at a future meeting around the non-resident, non-reciprocity tuition rate for fiscal year 19. I would say we heard a pretty strong sentiment among the board, not unanimous, during the budget setting process this last year, that not being at the median of our peers on this tuition rate when our resident rate is at the median of our peers is an equity challenge and a challenge for us politically as well. And as we continue to develop pipelines of students from other states that are interested in the quality and the educational experience at the University of Minnesota, the question becomes, why should we not be looking at that regard? So we've spent time with our enrollment management folks, our admissions folks, and we've come with a plan that candidly we need to act on sooner rather than later. The President's recommending a 15% increase in the NRNR rate for FY19. It moves to one that better reflects the quality of our educational experience. It's more in line again with the rate that our residential peers are paying. And we are experiencing growing demand because of the stature and the educational experience of the University of Minnesota. The challenge is, as we move these rates substantially, being transparent and honest with prospective students and their parents early rather than late is a critical point in maintaining the class coming in. I would tell you, as someone who has done enrollment and has done recruiting out of state and prior institutions, the unknown's worse than the known. And having a known number, even though it's a little bit outside the normal cycle for the board to consider, in our opinion, gives us the best chance to make sure we deliver the class that brings the revenue that we're looking at for this. So this is the reason why we bring this recommendation to you 9 months prior to the fiscal year starting, not for discussion today and not for action today, but for your consideration and discussion. So that leads us, and this would take us to, we believe that 15 years, 15% over 2 years, so 15 this year and 15 next year, with some uptick from our peers in the Big Ten, would put us right in the median of the Big Ten on NRNR rate for the publics in the Big Ten. So this would be step one. There'd be a second step, assuming our class came in. And so that feeds the overall budget process, and that moves to the next slide for discussion today with the board. The level of reallocation, input from the board, those cuts that Julie described that become a resource for us to fund initiatives that we've been doing, tuition rate changes, what your thoughts are on that, strategy for compensation and facilities, and planned programmatic investment along with financial aid. So we've laid out for you today, just at a high level, what are those major decision categories, what are those major expense decision categories that we need to work through, and then we'll continue to refine this process throughout this fiscal year so that it's an iterative and stepwise process to bring you a FY19 budget that's balanced, that's affordable, and that we can sustain this university. So with that, Mr. Chairman, we're happy to take comments or questions.
Thank you, Senior Vice President Burnett. And Vice President Tonneson, thanks for setting this up for us. As Vice President Burnett said, we have this for review today. There is no action. We've allocated plenty of time to really get some good discussion on it. Personally, I think being transparent ahead of time is a good idea, so I'm glad you guys brought this to us at this time. I'm asking if anybody wants to speak, and I see Regent Powell. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. And I have two questions. One quick one for Senior Vice President Burnett. You mentioned I think in the commentary on the 15% increase that some of the revenue generated from that will be put back into the recruiting initiative around out-of-state students. Could you just give us a sense of how much of the, I think it's 10 million that's generated is going to be spent on additional recruiting investment?
Senior Vice President Burnett.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regent Powell, right now we're budgeting about $1.5 million for a combination of both additional recruiters to ensure we bring that class in, but also to tuition discounting ability, meaning ways, retention awards for our current students that might be on the edge there. So there's a piece of it that our folks in admissions believe they need some tools, some additional tools. But again, with a $1.5 million expenditure on a $10 million, it's about an 85, we would net 8.5 million to the budget model if we embark on this plan, and that's the current plan we're working through with the admissions and through our model.
Thank you. One additional question. Yes, thank you. So I also want to thank you for bringing this initiative to us early, and also for the larger discussion of the big drivers of the budget and getting those in front of Regents early, and so that we can have a conversation on how we view the opportunities. And so I'll give you a few of my thoughts on how I will think about it going forward. So I think the first point is that I think we're going to need to continue to be very, very careful on tuition. The inflation is still quite low, both here and nationally, and personally I'm very uneasy with increases in tuition that would be beyond the rate of the personal consumption index, which is at about 1.5%. So I'll just offer a view that I think increases in tuition at a land-grant university beyond the rate of inflation, for me, are really problematic. The second point is that I think that as we work our way through the budget and we come to the end of the President's $90 million administrative program, which has been a really positive program from my point of view, and there's been a lot of success there, that needs to be replaced. I think that productivity just must be an ongoing exercise for us. I don't think of it in terms of cuts. I think of it in terms of process improvement and working smarter and simplification. And I'm pretty sure there's more to go for. And so that as we build the budget going forward, we'll need to continue to have, show a strong effort around productivity. And I think there's quite a bit more to go for. And then finally, the biggest component of the budget is compensation, and Vice President Torrenson has mentioned that. I think that we need a detailed look at compensation, not just at the senior administrative levels, which we've had some conversation on, but I mean, there are 25,000 employees. And it's the core part of the budget. And I think it would be useful to drill deeper into compensation strategy, midpoints, peer sets, how we rack up across the big range of compensation buckets, just to make sure that we are clear on the strategy and the outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Powell. Vice President Burnett, would you like to comment?
Just, Regent Powell, thank you for those comments. I do think we've got a placeholder, but we can certainly put together a presentation on compensation over the course of this upcoming fiscal year, and what we've done with job families and where we see our markets. There's no question we can put that together and bring that forward as we prepare for a recommendation about what we should do with compensation. So we've heard that one before, but we can certainly add it to this committee's work over the next couple of meetings. And I would share with you, we understand, and I think that a lot of great work was done over the last several years. When you look at those numbers that Associate Vice President Thompson put out, where the average over the last 5 years resident tuition at this university at the Twin Cities was 1.5%, and on the system campuses was less than 1. So I think that there's no question you're fitting right in with where this institution has been long before you joined the board and long before I joined the university, that there's been a concern about affordability, and I think it's reflected in those numbers we showed earlier. But thank you.
Thank you. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Regent Powell for touching on, I think, two of the three things that I wanted to just comment on. One is, this is a great process. I think that this is a wonderful opportunity for us to have access at this point. and the refinement of the information that's going to be available to us, I think, is going to really help us in this process. Can't help, Mr. President, but make the comment that I'm looking forward to this being our last process without a strategic plan as the first bullet on that sheet that shows what guides our thinking on this, and looking forward to that. But I actually think that this refinement itself helps us even in that process. So I appreciate the work that's being done. The second point I was going to make, Regent Powell captured. I think that we have far too diverse a cohort of employees to sort of look at it and say, well, this was the percentage this year. What was the base point, and how does that compare to the marketplace, and make sure we're taking care of people appropriately, and if there are places where we can be more efficient, we have to look at that as well. So I just would join that as well. I would want to point out that when we talk about the NRNR rate, for me, that asterisk that was on that page is really important, and that's, I think, has been lost a little bit in some of the previous dialogue about, there it is, about not violating the expectations of the folks that have come in under a different sort of model, and making sure that folks realize that they're valued and it's important to us, and we want to act with integrity as we move forward. And so, again, just that emphasis, I think, is important, and I appreciate that being placed on there, although you could have used a larger font. But I will also say that from the standpoint of getting there, my preference would have been to see this number start with a 3. But I do think that you are doing what we're asking. My issue is that the optics of where we are, this forestalls us a year longer. As I think my colleagues know, I would have been fine with just making the jump to the midpoint and then addressing the concerns about our current students in a different way. But I appreciate that in a couple of jumps we will get there. I would have maybe done it sooner. And with that, I would also say that from my perspective, with the additional revenue that, in response to Regent Powell's commentary, I'm still not looking, I'm not at the point of looking at NRNR students as a cash source. I still think that, I still look at it as a balance of state investment, likelihood of retention in the state, our mission to educate folks from the state. But so from that standpoint, out of that $10 million, I would be comfortable with even more of that being used to target students of need, students of exceptional capacity, and just understanding that my methodology is I'm not looking at that as, oh, good, here's more money for other things. It's really making sure we're strategic about that relationship. And then the last point I'll make, again, in talking about the keeping tuition at inflation or less, the way I'm wired, and I'm probably the only person sitting here right now, maybe not, is I look at those percentages in context. I'm still in a panic mode from what it used to be in 1990. And that the remarkable increase in the cost and the change in the relationship between the general public and higher ed that comes from that, I think, has been a challenge. And so when I look at this, I'm starting from a how long can we hold it? If we ever had the chance to actually bring it back, it would obviously require support from other sources to make sure we are keeping the quality where it needs to be and so on. But just my position is I'll push even harder on that inflationary increase, and that for me to even get to the inflationary increase, I want to see that there are no alternatives for us to continue to bend that curve back to a more accessible opportunity for higher education for folks without regard to the means that they bring to the table. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. President Kaler.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I feel like I sort of obligated to make this observation given the discussion and following on Regent Powell's point in the identification of this as a land-grant institution. It is a land-grant institution, and land-grant institutions are predicated upon support from the state government. And so when we have that partnership and it works well, we were able to freeze tuition. The curve, I'm very proud of that bent curve that you saw on the slide. We've worked really hard to do that, but it requires a partnership with the state. And when we have a flat appropriation, as we have this year, that requires other resources. And I pray that you will balance the quality of what we do, the resources we provide for students, the opportunity we provide for students against what we must ask from families and students for tuition. The value we bring, the ratio of what is given for what is paid is remarkable here. And we rely on the state in a partnership, and when that partnership is frayed or unable to deliver, we do have to ask students and their families to pay more, but they continue to get a great value. Thank you.
Thank you, President Kaler. Regent McMillan. By the way, before you start, Regent McMillan, I have a list of people here. I've seen all of your hands, so you're on the list, and I haven't forgot you, and I just saw one more. Okay, Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. You're being equitable and diligent and working your way around the board here. Two finer points on the conversation, and then one question. A cost focus, a relentless focus on cost is going to be required, and we don't want to sacrifice quality, but the compensation look has to become front and center for us. And I would add, here's the refinement, that we've got to look hard at the benefit side of this too. And I know that probably goes without saying, but some of the documentation that came with this, and 6 years into my service here, I still don't fully understand fringe pools. So even if base salaries stay the same, I understand fringe moves, and I think we're going to need a harder look at that, and that's going to be key. So just an ask there for what you develop, Vice President Burnett. Secondly, tuition, I think, is a campus-by-campus issue. We've leaned on some campuses here a decade ago to go deep into the tuition model and took central resources away from them. We now have a couple campuses that are incredibly tuition dependent and badly uncompetitive against other regional comprehensive universities. And as we go forward, just staying at the level of inflation won't work for those campuses. We're going to have to find other solutions, because if you're already 5,000 north of your competitor and they're going up at the rate of inflation and we stay at or just under, that doesn't help with the competitive disadvantage. So I think tuition is going to be easier to tackle in some places than others. And lastly, I support the move on NRNR, but I do so with a degree of caution, and that comes from two sources. One, we have a demographic problem in the state. We do not probably have the workers we need from a workforce standpoint, whether it's the company I work for or the companies represented around the table. So we need to import some talent. So as we raise that price, we got to watch that we're not stopping that input. But I support raising it. And secondly, we need diversity. So demographics and diversity, I think, are two places that the NRNR group supplies badly needed talent and badly needed people. And I think we got to go in with this eyes wide open. So we are, and we make no regrets decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent McMillan. Vice President Tonneson or Senior Vice President Burnett, do you want to say anything about fringe and briefly why it goes up when salaries don't go up as much?
We can certainly address it, and maybe we address it next month as we refine these and bring you what's in the fringe pool. Part of it is the way the federal government makes us allocate costs, and we had a refund that we had to weave into the fringe pool that we knew a couple of years ago was going to bring the fringe rates back. But why don't we back up and bring that as a more detailed discussion at the next meeting, if that's okay with you?
Terrific. That'd be terrific. And we've got a lot of people that have questions today. Regent Simmons.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to speak about and ask a question about the sort of important decision we make about tuition. And I want to at least have my position, and I hope the board's, based on data as well as philosophy and political realities. And that has to do with both how we set tuition on the various campuses, because I think that is a really important thing to do right. And I don't think we're doing it quite right. And then the other is on the demographics, and very specifically of the student population, very specifically about the non-resident, non-reciprocity students. We have some data, and that is sort of marketplace data we've heard about where we rank in our peer groups. What I'd like to know is what our experience has been with our increases over the recent years. How has that affected the attractiveness and retention of students from other states? And not just the numbers, but are they the same quality of students who are going to succeed here?
Vice President Tonneson, Senior Vice President Burnett, do you want to tackle that question?
Julie, when we've had those discussions, but go ahead, please.
Sure. Mr. Chair, Regent Simmons and members, I can give you a summary today, but then we can provide further information in December or prior to that if you wish. But basically, if you look at the last 2 years where we've had more significant increases in the rate, it's been two different stories, quite frankly, in my review of it. 2 years ago, so for the fall of FY16, the applications were actually up across the domestic and the international, but on the domestic side, the enrollment was down. So we lost students. The international was up, so we remained about flat. This last fall, we had a situation where early on the applications were actually down and the admissions offers were down, particularly on the domestic side, and admissions infused additional effort, both personnel effort and scholarship effort, into the process late in the year, then in the spring, and the enrollment actually increased. So we were able to really impact the yield rate by that extra effort in the spring. And that's a piece of what Senior Vice President Burnett was talking about when we want to build in on a recurring basis the funds necessary to maintain that level of support in the recruiting and retention process. So that's kind of the numbers, but that's what we've seen the last 2 years. Down the first year on the domestic side, up on international, and then this last year they were both up, but it took extra effort to get that. I don't have information specific relative to the quality of the students, but I have been told by admissions, and they can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that the quality of the applicants continues to be very high, and so what we are admitting continues to be very high quality students, equal to or better than they have been in the past.
Thank you. Regent Simmons, follow-up?
Thank you. I'm trying to inform my position, and philosophically and given political realities, I'd like to see further increase, a substantial increase in NRNR tuition, but not at the expense of being able to attract and retain students who are going to succeed here and ultimately serve Minnesota as our future workforce. So I don't think I have the answer today, and maybe you have more information. But the decision about tuition isn't just about how much revenue we can get and how we're going to rank with a peer group on a chart of tuition. It's really about the effect on admissions and the ultimate total revenue. So I'm not objecting to the 15% proposed increase, but I'd sure like a little help in knowing it's not going to hurt us.
Thank you.
We can certainly provide that, Mr. Chairman, Regent Simmons. We'll get that for you before December. But I think the point, as the stature and the abilities of our classes have grown over time, and one indication just being ACT scores, the worst thing we could do would be bring a non-resident, non-reciprocity student here who couldn't compete in the classroom with Minnesota students who are being admitted. So I think our admissions office is very thoughtful about targeting students that they know can succeed here academically and be a net gain to our retention and graduation goals, and not something that is a challenge for us. So we'll get these data for you before December, and it's a great question.
Thank you. Regent Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Building on Regent Simmons' comments, we're having this discussion about NRNR kind of on an island of Minnesota. I'd be interested to know with our peer universities, when they have raised outstate non-resident tuition, what that has done to applications, what it's done to yields, and what the net effect of that is, at least in the Big Ten. And that information, I'm certain, is is available. And also, then the second question is for individuals who are non-Minnesota residents, have come to the university, have studied, received their degree. How many of them stay here? How many stay here and become part of our economy? Finally, just a comment about marketing. If you ask residents, students, parents, potential students where you come from, if your son or daughter is going to go to college next year, one of the first things they will say is yes or no, and then you push further, and what is the reason of the no? Well, did you see how much it costs? I'm not sure we market it just right. If you look at commercial marketing today, they usually say starting at $400. In the marketing of colleges and universities, we're at the very top. You know, we start here and then we build backwards, and I think we lose some people in this marketing just because we start at the Cadillac model and we should be at a basic Chevrolet and build, you know, backwards, say, you know, here's the basics and here's what you can potentially receive in grants and scholarships and so on. So just a couple of observations about marketing, tuition, and finally, I do support the resolution, but I think we need to be thoughtful and judicious about it and just say, well, we're going to raise 15% on folks that are non-Minnesota residents. Have a nice day. We best be careful. Best be careful, because at some point in time, we're going to look and say, where did they go? What happened to them? So just to raise it to keep up with the Joneses, as we say out in the country, we have to have valid reasons for doing it and how we're going to spend that additional monies.
Thank you, Regent Johnson. Regent Cohen.
Thank you, Chair. This discussion is very helpful, very much what was presented, but also my colleagues' perspectives and comments. I'm very glad that some of us have talked about the emphasis on excellence. I want to make sure that, as you all probably know, that's one of my things, but this university has a lot of value, and we want to maintain the excellence and not cut so much that we don't have that. Secondly, I also think it is so important that we have the enrichment of the perspectives that our NR students bring to our Minnesota students. So I share some of the concerns that Regent Simmons, Regent Johnson, and so on mentioned, that we want to make sure that we really do keep attracting our NR students, that many, and I'd like to know too, how many do stay and help our workforce and so on. Specifically, one of the things that I question is, do we, and Ms. Tonneson, you did speak to it a little bit, in terms of our applications, our yield, are we getting as many NR students as we want, and what percentage do we want for our classes and so on? And then the last question I have, and it relates to what Regent Johnson said, is do families understand this discounting? I know that, I mean, when you look at a price, this is what the university costs for a non-resident, non-reciprocity student. That's what they see. Later in the process, if they're accepted and so on, there may be some discounting or other financial help. But are we, do people say, well, this is too much, I'm not even going to apply? So the whole concept of discounting after the application is a question for me. Thanks very much.
I don't know if there's questions there that Vice President Tonneson wants to address now. Maybe we should move on and just keep getting them. You can take those questions later. Yeah. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A lot of the comments I was going to make are then addressed, but for emphasis, I think for December it would be helpful to get more analysis about the NR, and there has been an increase in income from the raised tuition, but there's also been a cost of recruiting, so I'd like to see that. I'd also like to see the diversity numbers as they've tracked, as we've raised dollars, to see if there's been an impact there, and some detail around international versus non-reciprocity states. I think we've learned as much about the power of recruiting as we have about the market itself, and a couple of you have referenced being able to harness that into some of our underserved areas where we do have trouble recruiting. And those might not result in more income, but they would result in a better or representative set of class cohorts. So this is an opportunity to really rethink about recruiting and the model of recruiting, the power of recruiting. This is what business does. It's about acquiring customers, if you put it in those terms, and how you effectively obtain those. I would agree with Regent McMillan that the elasticity is so different among these campuses, and it feels as I go out to the outstate system campuses, there isn't any elasticity anymore. There's plenty here in the Twin Cities, so it's hard politically to put the Twin City rate higher than the others, but I think we're really going to be at that point going forward. I do agree with the President that it's unrealistic to hold our tuition flat or at a very low percent unless and until the state is willing and able to participate in their share of their land grant responsibility for funding. And I'm not going to be an apologist for the state or put this on the back of our employees or our needed investments if the state can't see their way to being a partner, and I hope that they will going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Since we've been talking about tuition, I'll start with that. I think we actually have answered Regent Cohen and some of Regent Simmons' question. If we look at the 7% in 15-16, 7.5 in 16-17, and 12.5 in 17-18, the number of applicants did go down. So we know that data's there. Now the yield rate, of course, is higher, which I think sends a signal. I think Vice Provost McMaster hinted at that is likely a situation where folks who know they can afford the increase are the ones who are applying, and those who can't, addressing Regent Cohen's question, are no longer applying. So how more recruiting will help that, we shall see. I'm in line with Regent Rocha to see where that extra or leftover $8.5 million is going to be targeting our resident students. So actual plan of, with this $8.5 million that's left over after the $1.5 for recruiting, we're going to spend those dollars in recruiting and offering scholarships, so on and so forth, to our resident undergraduate students, because that's a nice chunk of dollar. Question about the 15% over 2 years. So I see the asterisk. However, if a student enrolls in 2018, will they also see a 15% in the next year? No.
Is there an answer?
In the student.
Excuse me, Chair.
President Kaler.
Sorry. Excuse me. No. We are mindful of the obligation that we engage with when a student enrolls. And so students enrolled from out of state, we'll see at a maximum, I think we said 5.5% tuition increase.
He looks not for new.
Is that correct, Vice President Tonneson?
Mr. Chair, members, that is correct for the students that were here in the 2015-16 year. So our current sophomores and juniors, we committed to holding them to no more than a 5.5% increase through their time of graduation, or 2020. For this year's freshmen, we did not verbally make that commitment, and we explained that in the budget last spring. And of course, for next year's freshmen, that is on the table. We haven't implemented anything yet, so that would be a choice to make. But we did not communicate to this year's freshmen that they would be held to 5.5%.
So that's something that the board would have to decide where that, and then you guys we would need some budget implications.
Yes, and that is also, Mr. Chair and members, why we suggest we need some of the scholarship or discounting dollars for retention purposes. That would be to target that freshman class.
And that was included in your 1.5 or not included in your 1.5?
Mr. Chair, members, today the 1.5 would on the table would include that. As Regent Rocha mentioned, however, there in his comments that he would like to see more in that area. The budget isn't done, and so that's part of what this conversation is about as well.
So that's part of our discussion here, the way I take it, Regent Omari.
Thank you. Perfect. Just two more quick comments. One is I actually take a different view on the comparisons. I don't think we have an apples to apples comparison with any other institution, even in the Big Ten. If you take Michigan, Ohio State, Wisconsin, even Michigan State, IU, and Maryland, they have many factors that might lead to them increasing their NR tuition, including recruiting. But one of the other things that many don't like for me to say is winning major sports teams at their flagship institution, particularly men's basketball and football. And those things, there are direct studies that show that your applications will go up if you make runs in the major sports. So I don't think we actually have an apples-to-apples comparison with out-of-state, particularly not in the recent history. And then I'll completely shift to the compensation. And as we get more data on the job pools and the family studies, I'd like to see what variable compensations would look like, or compensation increases, particularly for the low and middle income earners across the system, and not for the higher income, and seeing what that might look like to have a variable salary increase.
Thank you, Regent Amari. I'm going to call on in just a minute Student Regent Miller. However, before I do, I just want to tell you and Student Regent Chen that I was remiss in introducing you earlier. By the end of the program, make sure you get a 1-minute biography ready, because I will ask you if we have some time, okay? Student Regent Miller.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Anderson. Chair Anderson, Vice President Burnett, in our conversations with students, we have found that one of the primary reasons that non-resident, non-reciprocity students considered attending the university in the first place over our peer institutions in the Big Ten is because of our comparative affordability. This drives many talented out-of-state students to pick our institution over our competitors and makes our institution, community, and state more diverse and vibrant. In contrast, we strongly believe that a 15% tuition increase for non-reciprocity, non-resident students, along with not having a 5.5% cap on tuition increase commitment for certain cohorts of students, would harm the future dynamism of this institution. So we're deeply uncomfortable with this tuition increase. What are alternative sources of revenue that you have explored aside from tuition increases on non-resident, non-reciprocity students in light of the political realities of state funding?
Do we have a simple answer for that, Vice President? Other alternatives for funding?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would just say that as Associate Vice President Tonneson laid out, there's no new state money in next year's budget, in the biennial budget. In fact, there was a $10 million decline that we didn't bake into the budget this year. The other major lever is resident tuition for residents of Minnesota. And if you looked at that pie chart, state support, tuition are really the two key levers. So those are the big ones. I mean, there are other things we can do that are college by college, unit by unit, but the big two are state support, which we project to be flat, and resident tuition, which you've heard today is a challenge for many Minnesota families as well. So there aren't really great, easy choices anywhere for this institution looking for how it puts its budget together next year.
Thank you. Hope that answers it. It's not an easy situation. Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. In general, I support the increase, and I think we're on the right track to getting to the midpoint of the Big Ten, although I think the midpoint is, that's the bare minimum that we should be at in terms of just the comparison to our peers. I am a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that we're only talking about NR right now, because you have to look at the resident tuition. I would support the 15% if I knew that the resident tuition would be either decreased, frozen, or increased below the rate of inflation. But right now we're not discussing that. The other thing is we have to be mindful of total cost of attendance, which the other components of the total cost of attendance are the room and board portion for the students who will be living in dormitories. In addition, I think this increase gets us to 2.2 times the, resident tuition for last year. So around 2.2 multiple, whereas a lot of our peers are already at a 3x or 4x multiple on their resident tuition. And obviously their situations are different. Their sports teams, may or may not outperform ours. But I think in terms of getting applications from NRNR students, we've never had a problem with that. Never. We always get enough applications. In fact, we've had the discussion about how many non-resident students we should even have on our campuses, and that discussion probably needs to be rediscussed in the near future. But the other comments that I have relate to some of the other questions my colleagues have presented. In terms of ACT scores, NRNR students outperform. So we have an increase in our average ACT scores due to the NRNR students that come here. So we don't have a problem with quality coming in if you believe that ACT is a measure of quality. As you all know, I believe in a test optional scenario, which hopefully we can discuss in the future. In addition, the issue about diversity, I think there, that's another discussion we need to have, but I don't think we need to import diversity necessarily, and we shouldn't be using NRNR to try to increase diversity here. Last point is Regent Omari made the comment about reduced applications. Well, there are lots of reasons for reduced applications, and admissions does have an analysis and a report on that. But I'll just point out that one thing they do every year is they look at the yield for certain places where they buy lists from. So if we have a low yield from a certain state, we may not market in that state as much, and therefore we'll have fewer applications from that particular state. So there are a lot of factors that we need to look at as we go, but we've never had a problem attracting NRNR students here. And I think a lot of the students that end up coming here do believe they're receiving a tremendous bargain, especially for the programs that we excel at. For example, chemical engineering. You can come here from out of state and get a really, really high quality education for probably cheaper than you would get in your own state. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Regent Hsu. Regent Regan.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Chairman, my strong support for the NRNR increase is probably not timely on the heels of the student regent's comments, but I do strongly support it. And Vice President Tonneson, I want to compliment you and Mr. Kaler on not spending that extra $10 million on base spending on things that are going to recur next year in our budget. So I compliment you on that. Having said that, colleagues, looking ahead for the next 6 or 7 months to next May, and I want to, on the back of an envelope, not even an envelope, a sheet, and just within the ballpark, close enough for government work, we call it. I want to tell you what my vision would be in 20 seconds of how we move forward in the next year with our budget. And I think we can do this together and reasonably and very appropriately with no increase in tuition, Regent Powell, as we look forward to May. If we go to the legislature and ask them for that $10 million that they did not give us in recurring money in this next biennium, if we continue with the President's Operation Excellence and maybe direct some of that money towards tuition rather than just towards reallocation, if we do some small addressing of our university staff, 26,000 people, Regent Powell, in the form of tuition, and if we do the NRNR 15% increase, folks, I think we can do this in May without an increase in tuition for any of our students, other than the NRNR students that we've already spoke about. And I know this is 6 months off, and it's a legislature in front of that, but I think it's very, very doable. I think it's reasonable, and that will be my focus between now and next May, is to make that happen. And Mr. Burnett, President Burnett, CFO Burnett, whatever it may be, I'm concerned that we would build our budget based totally upon what I think you thought was project state appropriation as flat. It just seems to me ironic that we just got off the capital bonding request where we're asking for the sky, We know we're not going to get that, but we're building our budget at flat without that 10 million, which I think we should be going asking for, and we should reasonably get members. We should get that. And it just seems to be ironic and not right to ask for the sky here and ask for nothing here and build our budget upon nothing here. Now, I assume we're going to ask for that 10 million, but we shouldn't be building our budget. We should be building our budget on the 10 million being there, because the legislature should come forward with that 10 million, I think. And just the comments I have, so you know where I'm going to be going, and I hope our group is going to be going in May of next year.
Thank you, Regents Regan. I appreciate all those comments, and I had to chuckle up here because I have done a little work with Senior Vice President Burnett, and much like you, from being in outstate Minnesota, the titles get to me, and I forget what to call people around here every once in a while. But I will tell you, Senior Vice President Burnett will respond to you, whatever you call him. I was at an event with him where he was called Bob about 7 times, and he kept answering. So if he can get through that, he'll get through whatever we want to call him. I think he wants to answer your question here.
Just Regents Regan, there's no question. What we've tried to bring forth is kind of a starting point and a conservative plan. And we have inquired with the state about would there be an opportunity to ask for that $10 million tailback. And they've kind of looked at us, well, you've heard revenues are not real strong right now at the state level. We're not sure there's even going to be a process. And candidly, the discord between the legislative and executive branches is kind of consuming a lot of people's attention. I'm not saying we couldn't go in and craft something like that and bring something to this board in December to look at before they convene, but I think we have to build a budget without an assumption that we can get that back. But if this board, just based on the feedback we've gotten from the executive branch in our conversations with MMB and others, because we have asked about it, because we understand Minnesota State has a tail as well. There'd be a compelling case for us to both go in. We asked about the process for doing that, and they're like, we're not sure there will be one, but we can certainly take the comments from this board and go back and renew those discussions at your direction.
We've got some others first here. I'm going to let Student Regent Chen go first.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. So I have a few points here. So I want to first echo the comments from Regents Simmons and Regents Beeson that I think additional data and analysis will be really beneficial for this discussion, because I think Vice President Tonneson mentioned the 2 different trends in the past 2 years on the domestic 1 year up, 1 year down, but that's not broken down into NR and Minnesota domestic, right? That's only domestic in general, 1 year up, 1 year down. Right. Yeah. So I think this is beneficial because, if we have this 15% increase in tuition, but then we see 15% decrease in the NR students, we probably don't see the projected 10 million revenue from this increase. So I think just in terms of this calculation, we need more data would be really beneficial. I think the second point is like how students may perceive or how they feel about this increase, because even within NNR students, there will be folks at the same time on campus where the more senior folks pay less than the newer student. They're all within the same category, but they pay quite differently at the same time on campus. So with that being said, maybe in the future it would be better that if we can do this increase 4 years ahead of time, but that's maybe a different story. But I just want to mention how people may feel when they are comparing themselves to other people who are also on NR. One last question is that since I represent the graduate students in general on the Twin Cities campus, I also want to ask, does this affect the tuition for the professional students and also for the graduate students as well, this increase of NR?
Vice President Tonneson, do you have an answer to that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, members, the proposal today is only for undergraduate non-resident, non-reciprocity students on the Twin Cities campus. It does not involve any graduate or professional students.
Thank you. Regent Simmons, you had a question on the last comment, and then I've got Regent Rocha to bring us home.
Thank you. Really just 2 things. And one, I do not think we've answered the question of what the impact has been on our tuition increases for NRNR, because we can interpret it different ways. And I've heard 2 different interpretations that actually aren't consistent with each other. So I think we need to try to get some help from admissions data on this, because I want to vote in an informed way, not just based on a philosophy. The second thing is I really think we need to have a clear understanding of the impact of the tuition at all the campuses. And I'd like to see that on the table in our eventual budget proposal as well. Are we setting tuition appropriately in Rochester, Duluth, Morris, and Crookston? I have concerns that we could do better there.
Thank you. Regent Rocha, and I guess we're going to let Regent Lucas bring us home.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple real quick points here, and this is a really good discussion. There was a point Regent McMillan made with respect to the system campuses. I think that's a really critical discussion to have, as Regent Simmons just pointed out. It is part of the conversation, I think, in the strategic plan for understanding how those campuses are going to operate and succeed and continue to develop their identity. So there's just so much to talk about in here, and it was one of the things that is very important to me as well. And when we talk about, I want to talk a little bit about the NRNR stuff. There's somewhat of an implication that for those of us that have taken a position on it, that we're doing it solely out of philosophy and not in an informed way. We have this information. When we started this conversation a couple of years ago, I went out and started checking on this, reviewing it, whether it's the Chronicle or other sources of data. We know an awful lot. We had an increase of double digits, I think about 13%. That was that first year when I made that motion on the NRNRs. I used the same percentage that it increased just a few years earlier because we knew that there was no effect on the trend line, that the applications and the quality stayed the same. We know what happens nationally. I don't know if I necessarily share Regent Omari's perception that the athletics is that big of a driver. Clearly, it does affect. The statistics are there. The applications go up when a school becomes on the national stage that way. But all of the schools that are of comparable nature, the major land grant schools, major research universities, large public universities, have seen the same level of increase in applications, in ACT scores. It's I mean, there are some variations, but ultimately we are on the same trend line as everybody else. In that respect, when we had the major drop in our tuition, we had a couple changes occur. One of them is we had fewer Wisconsin students, but what we don't recognize is that Wisconsin, that was when we shifted the reciprocity agreement with Wisconsin, so it was no longer a subsidy for a Wisconsin student. So it was less expensive to stay at a state school in Wisconsin. So that's why you had all these other NRNRs filling in that difference. And so we know all this. I wouldn't be taking this position if I actually thought there was going to be some catastrophic drop in students from other areas. And so I appreciate the comment that people will choose to come here because they see the cost proposition, but we actually have pretty clear data that, we even had a student representative make the commentary that that student's application to Minnesota was also joined by an application to Michigan. And had the student been admitted to Michigan, that would have been the student's preference, even though it was substantially more expensive, although the student still identifies our price as being a basis for selecting Minnesota. So, this data is all out there. We understand it. I think a lot of us received a letter from a parent who's an alumnus whose child was living in Illinois. They were upset because Iowa offered the student a scholarship and Minnesota didn't, or at least they offered a much larger one than Minnesota did, even though the net effect was going to be a lot more expensive at Iowa. They just saw that scholarship as being something that reflected value. So that data is all out there. I don't come to this position of our need without reflecting on all of this. And so I do look forward to the rest, to all of us then having access to this information, and I support that. But it is important, I think. It does affect the way the world perceives our quality. And I, without getting into specifics, if you look across our peer institutions and you say, well, which ones do you consider to be quality? They're all expensive. And you say, well, which ones are considered to be a little bit more workmanlike, if you will? And it'll be the ones that all have, conservative tuition rates. And so that does have an impact on how the value proposition outside of our state, and it has a huge impact on what the legislature sees as a preference for non-Minnesotans. Finally, I want to be really careful about talking about using NR as a source of diversity. I want our NR students to be diverse, background, race, ethnicity, I mean, any category you want to talk about. But I do not want to ever give the impression that the underrepresented communities in Minnesota are going to be passed over because we can get diversity from outside the state. We have a huge issue with the achievement gap in Minnesota. We need to, as a land-grant public institution, make the resource investments necessary to identify students who would not normally have had access and get them here, because that's how you really start to change lives and how you change your state. So those are my comments, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. Regent Lucas.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I don't want to be an echo chamber here because I've heard of so many things that I would want to say, but I've always been cautious about NR. I believe that our institution is richer because of geographic diversity, and I also think that the state has a talent deficit that bringing people from outside we have to be conscious of that. Someday the lines will cross, and I don't know where they are, but we need more information. In the future, though, I'd love to have a discussion about reciprocity and how this affects any budget items. And maybe it's just me, but I don't totally understand the reciprocity issue.
Thank you, Regent Lucas. I just want to wrap up this by saying this has been wonderful. It was a point of mine to try to get budget levers and budget on the agendas much earlier so we have time to talk about them. I think that's great. We're going to wrap this up. I'm just going to ask Senior Vice President Burnett if he has any closing comments.
I just want to thank the board for the input at this point. We've definitely taken some good notes, and we will bring you some additional information for December. And if we'll make sure we test that with you between now and December. But I think this input for the staff that work on developing the annual budget, this is really helpful to us, and I thank you for the time, and we'll take all your thoughts into consideration as we try and pull all this together. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move to the next item, which is our expansion of the commercial paper facility. As our presenters are stepping up, I just want to remind you we had review and introduction to this item last month, and it deals with issuing commercial paper and creating a larger commercial paper facility for cash flow purposes. We're going to have Senior Vice President Brian Burnett, Associate Vice President Michael Volna, Debt Management Director Carol Fleck, I see, is here, and it says Associate Vice President Stuart Mason. Well, there you are. Okay. So when you are ready, take it away, and we're going to have an action item on this. I believe there's a resolution in our packets about of this, so we'll eventually be asking for that motion. So Senior Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As they're pulling up the presentation, I just wanted to share with the board that we did present this last month. And candidly, what we're after here, and you may see that we last time talked about commercial paper program versus commercial paper facility. That's really the technical term, the legal term. Essentially, it's the same thing. But we had a robust discussion in September. We gave you a thorough, hopefully, understanding of this process. But essentially, the big idea is instead of using our cash to pay contractors as we build capital projects, there's an opportunity cost lost, and we could be issuing commercial paper with a significant spread that actually saves the university money. And so we think this is a program that they're going to walk you through one more time, ask for your consideration and action today. But in a lot of ways, this is part of us driving our cost of capital as low as possible given the financial strength of the university. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to the presenters at the table.
Mr. Volna.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, Senior VP Burnett, and members of the committee. We're here to seek approval for the enclosed resolution which would authorize the administration to proceed with the commercial paper facility. As Senior Vice President Burnett mentioned, we changed the terminology from the last time we presented this last month, primarily just to differentiate the fact that we currently have a commercial paper program in place, and this new activity that we're putting in place is a broader program. So to sort of minimize confusion over Program 1 and Program 2, we changed it to facility. Sorry if we confused anybody about that. We worked with the board office to confirm that the current resolution would fit within existing board policy. There are no changes to board policy needed to do this, so the resolution would function as your authorization to do that. And then finally, all the things that Senior Vice President Burnett mentioned with respect to the benefits are totally true. The reality is we will need a couple months to actually implement some of the administrative activities for this. So likely that it would be the end of December or early January before we actually would have the facility up and running with a second dealer and actually functioning. But with that, I will turn it over to Carol Fleck, who will walk you through a brief couple slides on this. Stuart Mason's here for backup on any questions you might have about any of the activity related to the investing and so forth. So we are here to go.
Chair Anderson, members of the committee, I only have a few slides because we went through this in detail. So just to kind of summarize the things we talked about. Again, we're seeking board approval to establish this commercial paper facility, and we've set a level of $400 million maximum. Upon this facility approval, the issuance would occur as needed based on project spending. So as you know, you approve projects as the board. We begin the project spending using university cash. Upon approval of the facility, we could issue the CP as needed in an amount to cover the spending, and then we would be reimbursing ourselves. And that process would continue until the project is done or until we reach a maximum of the facility. And at that point, we would make a decision to convert the CP to long-term debt, and again, we would come back to the board for approval to do that approval. In summary, the facility characteristics, as the resolution says, we would be able to issue either tax-exempt or taxable CP, but only issued for capital projects. This is not intended to help cover any of our operating expenses. We talked about we do have existing series outstanding A through F. They total about $240 million, and those 6 series would be pulled into the facility. Therefore, that leaves the capacity to issue with a $400 million facility capacity, less the 240 outstanding of $160 million that we could issue without coming back to the board each time we needed additional funds. It would be our first choice of debt financing during project construction. It is not required. We could issue long-term debt also, but it would be the first thing we would consider so that we would not need to be using university cash. And those issuances would be based on the actual spending on a mix of projects underway. That entire facility would be rated by the rating agencies based on the maximum authorized, regardless of how much we have outstanding. This has been discussed with the rating agencies, as we mentioned last month, and they were supportive of this and felt that we had the capacity to use our self-liquidity for that maximum amount. So overall, our goal is to lower the overall cost of capital by bringing more variable rate debt into our portfolio at a lower rate of interest would lower that cost of capital. The second point would be to increase earnings on our cash. That way we could invest the cash in investments as opposed to using them on the projects, and then add the flexibility and nimbleness to our issuance process by being able to pull in the debt as we need, as we spend, as opposed to coming to the board each time we need to issue. And with that, there is a resolution in the docket that is laid out that we're asking for your approval.
Thank you, Ms. Fleck. In its simplest form, what I see this as a layman is that as we have construction projects going, in general today we spend money out of our cash account until we long-term finance them. The money gets put back in our checking account, like our family's checking account. What this would do would give you this commercial paper facility of, we're going to vote on a maximum $400 million that is revolving, basically. You would issue that, and by definition, I understand commercial paper can be issued for 270 days. Is that correct? And you would use that money, so when we do the long-term debt on the project, the money gets put back into the commercial paper facility, and it has nothing to do with our checking account and our ongoing operations. So we're never really, it's a net money deal, other than you believe we'd get a better interest rate by doing commercial paper.
Chair Anderson, you get a A- for describing the program. It's very, very good. All I would say is that
Better than he ever got in school.
It is a money program with two benefits. One, it retains our own cash so that Stuart and his team can invest it and generate higher earnings, and the money that we are using through debt is at a lower cost. So that's sort of the net money part. Otherwise, you did a...
And I just wanted to I studied a little bit, and it's not as complicated as it seems. I wanted my colleagues to know that, at least in my case. Vice President Burnett.
So you've got the concept. The issue is when we use our cash, we lose the opportunity to earn 1.25% interest, and we can issue commercial paper at 70 to 75 basis points. That spread is the opportunity cost lost by not having this facility in place. So this should increase our earnings on our cash balances with no appreciable effect of paying our contractors as they build our buildings and do our renovations. That's the piece we're asking for permission.
So with that, I'm going to open it up and see if there's any questions from the people on the board. Otherwise, we will go to the resolution. Actually, first, we should see if there's anybody wants to move the resolution. Maybe we should.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Regent Powell.
Regent Anderson, Chair Anderson, I'd have given you an A. So I think this is a terrific program. The question I have is so what is the sort of net reduction in financing cost, annually that you think will come from this? And then what happens? Where does that money then show up? Could it show up on Regents Regan's envelope, or does it go into the operating budget, or where does it show up?
Vice President Volna.
Chair Anderson, Regent Powell, last month we showed you a slide that showed that all other elements of the debt portfolio being equal, making this change would lower the overall sort of average interest rate of the portfolio by about 28 basis points. So that's sort of the net impact of this in terms of lower short-term interest costs on the overall portfolio.
And then if I could just follow up, can you translate that into a range of financing cost savings?
Vice President Mason, want to try that?
The second part of your question was, where does the money show up?
Well, it's how much is it, and then where does it show up?
So it's, as Senior Vice President Burnett mentioned, there's a spread. The spread tends to be about 75 basis points between what we issue the paper at and what we invest at. And if you apply that 75 basis points to the incremental $160 million in this new facility, you end up with $1 million to $1.5 million annually that shows up in increased earnings in the tip pool. And the earnings from the tip pool typically are in the $15, $16 million range, so this would be an increment there. And all of those earnings go to the central reserves, where they are reallocated across the university.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have a question over here from Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Regent Anderson. I don't know that I'd give you an aim. This is where great inflation shows up.
Yes.
You did a pretty good job.
I would like you to know that I'm a mortuary science major and not a finance major.
We know that, yes. Okay. Thank you. As a banker, I like to talk about risk. This has risk. You've addressed risk. There's a liquidity risk. There's a counterparty risk. And there's the suddenness of interest rates going up, and those of us that live through inflation and double-digit, well into double-digit, money, that amount of earnings that's been quantified could disappear pretty quickly if we're not able to monitor this at a moment's notice and really anticipate the market rather than just react to it. But it is a good program. You're making our money work harder, and I appreciate Senior Vice President Burnett and the staff's work on bringing this to the board.
At this time, I'm going to call for a vote on the resolution on the table. All those in favor of the resolution expanding the commercial paper facilities signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. Thank you. We are going to now move on to, I guess, Associate Vice President Stuart Mason can stay right there. We're going to move on to our update on our asset allocation guidelines. Again, we had a review on this last month, and we've got the program that they would like to do for guidelines. We're probably going to see a small presentation, and I'm going to ask for later I'll ask for a motion to accept a resolution on this. Vice President Burnett is going to start. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Associate VP Mason and Senior Director Andrew Parks presented 3 recommended asset allocation guidelines to this committee in September. I recall a great conversation that day that brought focus and clarity to this topic. As a reminder, the Office of Investments and Banking has worked extensively with our Investment Advisory Committee, of which Regents Beeson has been a member over the past year, to develop and refine this new framework for asset allocation. I would note that the IAC fully endorses this recommendation, and today we are asking for the board to approve these asset allocation guidelines, and Stuart and Andrew are going to give you a refresher of what was presented last month and be able to take your questions. Thank you.
Associate Vice President Mason.
Thank you, Chair Anderson and board. Just as a refresher, there is on page 90 of your docket materials a resolution which changes the asset allocation framework that is associated with the investments we make in the endowment. This resolution turns out or ends up being in the form of an appendix to Regents policy, and it is an appendix so that the asset allocation framework may be changed periodically to reflect or in reaction to market conditions as they change. As we discussed with you last month, looking forward over the next decade, we view the low return environment that is a result of very high current asset prices, both stocks and bonds and other assets. The low return expectations prompting us to want to change the asset allocation framework to give ourselves a little bit more flexibility to consider alternative or idiosyncratic types of investments that currently don't have a place in the existing format. Again, as a refresher, the primary goal of the endowment is to preserve the inflation-adjusted assets within the endowment to really secure the intergenerational equity over time. The biggest risk we face at the moment is, frankly, failing to meet the CPI plus 5% or approximately 7.5% return targets over the course of the next decade. And that really prompts us to move forward with this recommendation. This particular slide we reviewed with you, and it's really a schematic that shows the new framework. And it's divided, instead of 6 relatively traditional asset classes, which are in the current framework, this provides larger baskets that are driven largely by the investment objectives rather than the type of assets. And so there is a rationale behind each of these 3 large buckets. The stability bucket is basically cash and treasuries, which is our liquidity source for funding the distributions to the university, uncalled capital on some of our private funds, and a pool of reserves to take advantage opportunistically of new things that might come up unexpectedly. The diversifiers bucket is really the new category, and it is designed to be completely uncorrelated or largely uncorrelated with the movements in the equity markets. So it might be a collection of, or is in fact a collection of assets that may largely be driven by a portion of the return being cash flow or income related. For example, it might be mineral royalties or reinsurance premiums or infrastructure income and so forth, which are examples of investment opportunities that currently don't have a place in the existing portfolio. And the largest of them is still the growth bucket, and this would be assets that are correlated to CPI growth in various segments of around the globe, earnings per share growth in terms of corporations that are public, and the like. So this is equity beta, or equity-oriented returns, higher volatility, and higher return expectations. So how does this differ from our current framework? This was a schematic that we shared with you last week or last month. You can see that there is a reduction in the fixed income allocation of approximately 5%, and that gets reallocated into higher returning, uncorrelated with equity assets that are largely stable or idiosyncratic and unrelated to the equity beta. Beyond that, there's relatively modest changes in our current asset allocation. But as I mentioned earlier, the framework gives us an opportunity to expand in areas we currently are really not able to do so. What's the overall effect on the portfolio? We've run mathematical regressions, Monte Carlo scenarios by the thousands, to try to get an idea under different scenarios how the new portfolio might react, and the takeaway is modest increase in the return. If you think about our target as 7.5%, current portfolio is geared in the existing market to return 7.4%, so a little bit of a shortfall. This would increase that by 50 basis points. The volatility remains about the same. The probability of achieving 7.5% obviously goes up a little, and the risk of not achieving it over long term declines. In fact, adds a surplus of over a long period of almost $100 million to the endowment. This last slide is a schematic of the metrics within the new allocation framework and the resolution. So there are three buckets. One stability is 5 to 15%, diversifiers 20 to 40%, and growth assets 50 to 70%. And you can see below that subcategories within these buckets that also have ranges around them. In addition to that, on the on the equity or the growth factors segment of the portfolio, we've included targets. They're not point specifics, but target ranges for U.S. exposure, outside U.S. exposure, and emerging market exposures that you can see outlined in the lower right-hand corner of the box. So, having said that, I stand for questions.
Thank you, Vice President Mason. At this time, why don't I entertain a motion to adopt the resolution?
So moved.
Second. Moved and seconded. So we have the resolution to approve the guidelines on the table. Are there any questions to the presenters? Student Representative Chen.
Yeah. Thank you, Chairman Anderson. I think Regent Shu in the last meeting asked a similar question. So I think you have a new strategic way of thinking that you categorize them into three different buckets. But then when you bring them down into smaller buckets and even into the very ground level nano buckets, then they're still the same classification. Some are equity, some are fixed income. But this is more of a new way of strategic thinking. I guess my question is that is the merit really that your ability to fine-tune the ranges at your discretion, like 5 to 15% for the stabilizer, compared to the previous pie chart that you've shown before? Is that the real merit that you can fine-tune these ranges?
President Mason?
Yes. There are ranges for each of the buckets, and they are designed to give us the flexibility as market conditions change to flex around a centralized point target. We've run regression models around the midpoints of each of those targets to give you some of the results that I discussed earlier. But given that the stability bucket is cash and treasuries, very liquid securities, and a large portion of the growth bucket is public equity on a global basis, we do have the flexibility to trade those securities in days or short periods of time to make fluctuations or changes as we think tactically the markets would dictate.
Thank you. Thank you. Regent Powell.
I want to thank you, Chair Anderson. I want to thank Vice President Mason for, I think, a very, diligent, well thought through proposal. And I also appreciate the use of the advisory committee, which I know Regent Beeson sits on. It just seems to me a great way to think about the risk of these kinds of proposals, and I find it to be a really good model. And maybe at another time we can talk about whether there are other ways to apply the same idea to other areas of the university. So I appreciate that. My question is, how should we think? I guess first of all, how much additional return do we think that this change generates, and how should we think about that? Should we think about as raising the odds that we're going to get the return that we need, or does this have an operating impact? So it's really, again, like the previous question, how should we think about the additional return that we hope will be generated?
Vice President Mason.
Yes. Chair Anderson, Regent Powell, and committee. I think the best way to think about it is it increases the odds of being successful because it gives us a little bit more flexibility and it gives us some tools within the broader investment context that we currently don't have. The models with the modelings, for what they're worth, would suggest that it increases the long-term return profile by about 50 basis points. So it goes from 7.4% to 7.9% over a 20-year time horizon. But I think the more productive use or the more productive way to think about it is it increases the odds of us being successful.
Vice President Burnett.
So Regent Powell, recall that largely this money is restricted in the endowment, so it's really governed by the rate, the 4.5% that we, so the challenge, so there wouldn't really be an operating budget increment for this change. What we're trying to do is make sure we can pay the 4.5 and preserve intergenerational equity. So there's really not, I don't see an O&M or a budget situation affecting here. It's how do we protect that intergenerational investment in our endowment, and this, as Stuart has pointed out, dampens volatility while raising the likelihood of hitting that target. So that's why we're bringing it forward today, but I don't see it having any impact, unlike that last discussion on the FY19 budget, because we would have to change our payout rate that would have a material effect on the programs that get the benefit from the endowment.
Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, presenters. The best way that I've been able to sort of characterize this is really moving from traditional product types into categories that are a little more descriptive of what their underlying characteristics are. And it will not result in a massive redeployment or reinvestment of our investment fund, but something that will be more intentional. I do want to follow up with Regent Powell's comment, and I hope he's able to socialize. He and I have talked about it, but it's pretty powerful when you have private and public sector people engaged with the university, both on the debt side and the investment side. We are bringing the best practices, and those people work without compensation, and they work throughout the year on high finance issues, and there are other ways to deploy people around the university, and I hope that can move along quickly, that conversation can start quickly.
Thank you. With that, we are going to ask for the vote. So I'm going to ask for the vote. It is, again, to approve the new asset allocation guidelines as presented in your resolution. So at this time, all those in favor of the new asset allocation guidelines signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Parks, Mr. Mason, Mr. Burnett. At this point in time, we're going to ask Vice President Brown to take, as I like to say, the witness table and tell us a little bit about collective bargaining agreements that we've had ongoing and have reached somewhat of a conclusion with, that after her presentation we will be approving. I think the best way to go, we have several of them. We will do them one at a time. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Vice President Brown.
Yes, Chair Anderson, members of the committee. That is correct. We have three. Two are in your docket materials. One was completed after the docket materials were sent to you. So on page 97 of your docket materials is a docket sheet for the collective bargaining agreement with the University Education Association, which represents the faculty at our Duluth and Crookston campuses. This is a 3-year agreement. We're very pleased to have that. So that started at July 1, 2017, and will continue through June 30, 2020. There is, in the first year, a 2% increase, which is what all employees at the university receive. Well, not each employee received, but was the total of the compensation pool for this fiscal year. In the second year, we have what we call a Me Too agreement, which means that they will get no less than whatever is in the compensation memo for the Twin Cities faculty, and they will also each get a $300 lump sum amount. And in year 3 is also a Me Too agreement. Again, they will get no less than what is in the compensation plan for the Twin Cities faculty. The numbers are listed, the actual expenditures, and I'd be glad to take any questions about this. There were no significant language changes in this negotiation.
Thank you, Vice President Brown. Before we take questions, do we have a motion for the proposed labor agreement with the University Education Association?
I move its approval.
McMillan, is there a second? Second, Regent Johnson. Okay, the motion is on the table. If there are any questions of Vice President Brown, Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Vice President Brown, on page 97 of the docket materials, there's the last bullet point. It says that this is effective the first pay period in the fiscal year. The aggregate salary base will increase by no less than the percentage in the university's spring 2019 academic salary memo. So I assume that's just what we would approve in the budget for that year.
Yes, Chair Anderson, Regent Hsu, that bullet applies to year 3 of this agreement, and the same is true in year 2, that it would be what we call a Me Too agreement, and it would be what the board approves in the budget process for the annual compensation pool. It would be no greater than that, or no less than that.
No less than that, yes. So, and I see that in there for 2018 also.
Mm-hmm.
Are we boxed in by how we will look at compensation in the future? We had an earlier discussion today about talking about looking at various levels of compensation. And traditionally we have a single percentage that we apply to everybody. But if we were to break that out and to have percentages for various levels and classes of employees, how would this affect that? Would it just be the portion that we decide to increase for the people encompassed by this agreement?
Chair Anderson, Regent Hsu, I don't believe it would limit us in that it specifically talks about the academic salary memo, and the discussions were really to make sure that the faculty in Duluth and Crookston were in line with the amount of increases with the faculty in the Twin Cities. So to that extent, there might be a limitation or a consideration, but in terms of looking at other employee groups, I don't believe there would be a problem.
Regent Hsu. One more follow-up. Thank you, Chair Anderson. So earlier this month, or maybe it was last month, we received a memo, I believe, from the Chancellor of Duluth and Chancellor Black. And in that, he made a reference to the reference point that the savings that he and his staff had engineered into their budget were basically erased by an increase that was made on salaries later in the year during our normal budget setting process. So how do we look at in this case Crookston, and are these numbers? I guess the numbers can't be baked into any budget they have because we haven't budgeted for those years yet. So, I mean, are we basically putting ourselves in a situation where if we do increase salaries more than Crookston is expecting, it would increase their costs and maybe cause problems with their budget.
Vice President Brown or Vice President Burnett would like to have a chance at that.
If I can, Regent Hsu, I mean, when we put the budget proposal together, it's system-wide, so we would have to account for this language, and I think that President Kaler can also comment that when we recommended a 2% salary pool, we did not want to exclude any campuses, and there's no question Duluth had to make some changes based on the decision. When we put the budget together that we talked about earlier, we would have to take into account this agreement that we couldn't. And I think there's also a case for talking about why you wouldn't want to consider compensating your Duluth and your Crookston faculty at a different change than your Twin Cities faculty. That's the consequence of this decision, but it doesn't lock us in that there has to be an increase, and that's why we're recommending it to you. So there's no question that Associate Vice President Tonneson and her work and all the work that the budget team does has to bring this into account, and it's just now part of the levers we have to work through in our budget process for both 19 and 20, given this agreement, should you approve it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? I guess I do. I have Regents Figum.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Almost forgot you.
It's easy to do. Vice President Brown, just a quick question, if I could. You had mentioned that this compensation package, the total compensation pool is 2%. I'm assuming by that means that there's some performance base in there, and somebody might be able to get 2.5% and somebody else 1.5%. Is my assumption correct?
Vice President Brown.
Chair Anderson, Regent Svigum, that is true generally speaking for the compensation pool. In the collective bargaining agreements, it is dependent upon the language in each collective bargaining agreement how the compensation pool is delivered.
So, Mr. Chairman, help me then, make it more simple for me. In this compensation pool, the one we are currently talking about, then is there some performance-based incentive or disincentive in there or not? Can somebody get 2.5% because they have done a great job? Somebody else not doing so good get 1.5%.
Regent Brown, or Vice President Brown.
Yes, Chair Anderson, Regent Swingham. In this particular agreement, I believe there is a small portion of the compensation pool, not the whole of it, that can be delivered based on merit.
A small portion. And in the other packages coming forward, a small portion too, or a bigger portion based upon performance?
Vice President Brown.
Chair Anderson, Regent Swigum, in the other two that I am bringing forward today, they do not have any merit-based delivery in them.
Okay. Unfortunate, Vice President Brown. I think we should have packages, members, that allow for some base increases, but certainly performance based upon some type of management decision of a supervisor should account for recognizing great performance over average, over maybe less than average performance. I find that unfortunate that we don't have that in the packages.
Senior Vice President Burnett.
Regents Figum, I think Vice President Brown would agree that those are things we work towards in the negotiating process. We agree with you philosophically. Sometimes we can move that conversation. In some ways we can't. So I do think philosophically from the management side we do try and negotiate in that vein. And sometimes we're more successful in some negotiations than others. But philosophically I don't think we disagree with you at all.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Vice President Burnett and CIO Burnett and CEO Burnett and Brian, whoever you are, and I mean that very affectionately.
Thank you.
I don't take this. I'm not blaming you in the negotiations. I understand negotiations take place. You can only move the lever so far, and there's a pushback. I'm not blaming you. Please understand that. I just wish we would be able to be more successful in a performance-based reimbursement of our staffs.
I'm going to call the vote on this agreement at this time, and we'll move on. If there are more questions, or Regent Beeson have a question on this?
Thank you, Mr. You know, I agree with Regent Spigum that this is I think it's the direction we've been going, but And it may be a philosophy, but I don't recall whether it's in as a guiding principle. And so as we look at our compensation philosophy or our compensation policy going forward, I think it's got to stand out that we need to direct. You are moving that direction, I believe, but we do need to state that, because it's, in my opinion, it's the right thing to do, to have performance-based and it show up on compensation. And it's not, I'm not asking you to answer the question today, but I think we do need to have it in front of us.
Okay, thank you. Vice President Brown.
Chair Anderson, Regent Beeson, it is part of the Regents policy already, and it is certainly part of our day-to-day working responsibilities.
Thank you. At this time, I'm going to ask the vote for the proposed labor agreement with the University Education Association. I want to make sure I got the right one first. There's been a motion that's on the table. All those in favor of the agreement signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Vice President Brown, I'll have you move on to the next agreement.
Yes, and just in closing on the previous, I'd like to thank all those that participated in the negotiation process. It's always a commitment of time and energy, and people did a very good job. The same is true for the next one. This is the AFSCME Local 3260, our healthcare unit. This is a one-year agreement, and this is an across-the-board increase of 1% and then progression steps for eligible employees that total about 1% in expenditures for a total of 2% for the cost of the total agreement. And again, those numbers are there. This is a unit of approximately 195 employees that work in our various healthcare delivery facilities across our campuses.
At this time, I'll entertain a motion for the resolution related to the proposed labor agreement with AFSCME Local 3260. Is there a motion?
So moved.
So moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Regent Cohen. Okay, it's on the table, and we can. Any discussion on this agreement? If not, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor of the proposed labor agreement with AFSCME Local 3260 signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Vice President Brown, I'll ask you to move on to the final agreement.
Yes, thank you. Chair Anderson, members of the committee, this is the final. This is with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 292, radio and broadcast technicians. This is a very, very small unit, 2 employees. This is an across-the-board adjustment of 2% to all wages.
At this time, I would like to entertain a motion for the labor agreement with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Is there such a move?
So move.
So move, Regent Regan, second Regent McMillan. Any discussion on this agreement, on this resolution? If not, I'll ask for the vote. All those in favor of the resolution on the proposed labor agreement with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. Motion carries. Vice President Brown, I think, you have one more item on the agenda. And I do want to thank you. While you have somebody else coming up, it looks like, I do want to thank you for your tireless work on not only these agreements, but other things you've been doing in the university. So thank you.
Thank you.
You're going to be joined by Senior Director Ken Horstman. And we're going to learn a little bit about amendments to the university's faculty retirement plan. Regents, for your notification, this is just for review, and we will not be acting on anything at this time. Vice President Brown.
Yes, Chair Anderson, members of the committee. I'll just make a couple of introductory remarks, and then Senior Director Horstman will be really discussing what's happening here. The main thing I want to emphasize is this is not a change in our fundamental elements of the faculty retirement plan. We, through audit processes, discovered a couple of errors. Ken will talk about those, and this amendment is simply to allow us to fix or correct those errors. But this is not a change to our fundamental elements of the faculty retirement plan. So with that, I'll let Ken get started.
Chair Anderson, Regents, student representatives, Senior Vice President Burnett, thank you for the opportunity to review this matter.
The faculty retirement plan is a tax-qualified plan, and its administration is governed by the University of Minnesota Faculty Retirement Plan formal document, which the Board of Regents have approved, and it has also received the approval of the Internal Revenue Service. Currently, this plan represents over 9,500 active participants and $3.4 billion in assets. When the university as plan sponsor determines an error has occurred, the university must act to correct the discrepancy. Often such corrections require an amendment to the plan document, and should the cost impact of the amendment be greater than $250,000, the authority to approve such an amendment resides with the Board of Regents. Any correction that includes multiple plan years can require a voluntary correction program, or VCP, submitted to the Internal Revenue Service. The VCP is used regularly by retirement plan sponsors to proactively correct errors in administering their plans, and the IRS views these self-corrections favorably and, in fact, encourages plans to use them. The resolution before the board requests your review and possible approval in December on such an amendment to our plan document. Approval of this amendment will allow the university to move forward with a voluntary correction program to the IRS on the two issues related to covered salary on the plan, as described in the background information of the docket item summary. One issue is the long-standing matter related to eligibility of summer earnings, and the other is a more recent issue involving the eligibility of earnings for employees with multiple appointments. In both cases, this resolution will provide a complete solution to these issues. The recommendation to restore accounts for under-contributions and related lost earnings under the summer earnings issue, while allowing the over-contributions from both issues to remain in participants' accounts, is a solution that has the support of our outside legal counsel and has been reviewed with internal leadership from the Office of the General Counsel, the Office of Human Resources, the Office of Internal Audit, the Office of Budget and Finance, Investment and Banking, and Senior Vice President Burnett. In addition, we have received a second legal opinion from an independent outside law firm which supports this approach. We have also used an independent accounting firm to review our data and calculate the lost earnings based on the Department of Labor EBSA voluntary correction program calculator. Finally, this recommendation makes participants whole in regard to under-contributions, but does not adversely impact those participants who have received over-contributions, many of whom are former employees and retirees. Today, we ask for your review of the proposed amendment to the faculty retirement plan as stated in Attachment 1, and if approved at the December meeting, this will authorize the university's administration to implement the amendments going forward. And with that, I'll stand for questions.
Do we have any questions on this? Again, it's a review item. May I ask the question? Is this is more or less a bookkeeping item and there's no cost to the university?
There is a cost to the under-contributions. This has been a long-term issue. In the background information, we state that we will be going back to the start of our common payroll platform in 2000 to 2014 when the summer's earnings issue was corrected by a passed amendment moving forward from that date. And those under-contributions in principle represent about $574,000. The current status of lost earnings on that, which will change given there is a future date for the contribution, as of June 30th was about an additional $330,000. This money should have been contributed over past years. We have the funds reserved from salary savings and targeted for this correction, so that is in place. So yes, there is a cost to it, but in reality, we should have been making this contribution over that period of time.
Thank you. Is there any questions from my peers? Student representative.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I just have a clarification question regarding Attachment 1 section, and within the plan, Section 203. It concerns the duration of participation. In the event of a participant's termination of employment, what happens to the money that is in their specific fund?
Chair Anderson, student representative, the faculty retirement plan is a 401A plan, and the vesting on the university contribution to participants is fully vested upon contribution, as well as the portion that is their own personal contribution, obviously. So when they leave the university or terminate their relationship to where they're no longer a participant, that money is theirs to either leave in the plan or to roll over to another qualified plan. So that is available to them based on the rules of the plan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I was just wondering if you could tell us whether all of the problems with the PeopleSoft 9.2 system have been taken care of.
Sir.
Related to this.
Okay. Chair Anderson, Regent Hsu, I would probably choose to phrase that differently. We have a very complicated employment environment with multiple appointments, which I think you're referring to in regard to the 9.2 change. That change actually brought to light some of these issues that we're addressing now. And, so it has us taking a different look after a streamlining of our earnings codes at how we should apply eligibility to salary at the university. So that's really the process we went through. We are making an adjustment to our system going forward, which will correct for this, and this will be a complete solution for this particular issue. Thank you.
Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Just in the sake of time, I think I'll just make a comment instead of asking a question, but I'm happy to know that we can cover the cost of this. I imagine that this cannot all be blamed on technological error, and I'd imagine that when we do a PeopleSoft upgrade, we hire consultants and we have internal employees and so on and so forth. So I'm very interested in how we do contracting to see if we can in the future have whoever we consulted with cover some of the cost of the error, or how our employees are being reviewed in their performance, because $1 million is $1 million. And
sure,
it's up to you if you want to answer.
Chair Anderson, Regent Omari, I can appreciate that sentiment. I just want to see if I can clarify the situation. The summer earnings issue is a long-term issue that probably started prior to 1973. And while we are not governed by ERISA, ERISA did not come into place until 1974. So in those days, there were probably well-intentioned, thoughtful decisions made about what earnings were eligible under the plan and which were not. So it really is outside of a system issue. What probably didn't allow people to connect the dots for many years was that without a common payroll platform, in the decentralized environment, people were making isolated decisions. Once that was in place, we had a better picture that this was going on, and over the years, I think we had to understand what the legacy of those decisions were, because it took into account how our appointments were viewed in the past, plus some guidance from the National Institute of Health. The other process, I wouldn't look at that as a technical issue, but again, we were looking at our business processes about how we set up appointments, and then with the new system, how do we manage and administer that in the future. So and maybe it's because I've been looking at this so long, I look at this as hopefully a process improvement going forward, and that we will continue to monitor this, and hopefully we will never be in front of you with a 60-year-old problem again.
Thank you for bringing it to our attention. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that takes care of that item. We are now going to move on to the consent report. It's going to be Senior Vice President Brian Burnett. You've all read in your docket some of the things, but he's going to go over them. At the end, we will entertain a motion to approve all of them at once, if that is what you'll choose. So at this time, Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. There are 8 items in the consent report. Nothing really to report on the contingency. We have 1 purchase of goods and services over $1 million. 1 real estate transaction. This is for the Rochester campus. It's a strategic location. It is city money. To Regent Johnson's earlier comment, this is city money that would be used for potentially a future UMR campus. It is something that they've been working on quite some time, has the support of the city to use the money allocated to UMR, and so we're recommending that purchase move ahead. We do, under the board's reserved powers, we do any change in the view of a campus requires your approval. We need to take down an old quarantine barn that's been vacant for quite some time, so we'd like permission to knock that down. And then an item that we've talked to many of you about that's in your materials, not surprising, we need you to act on a nomination on Pioneer Hall from the State Historic Preservation Office to place it on the National Register of Historic Places. I would just say that there's been great discussion. We've had we gave you materials in advance of this meeting. There's no question, I think, that we are working very hard to preserve the historic integrity, particularly of the exterior of Pioneer Hall. But placing it on the National Register would really limit our abilities to make it a functional 21st century learning and living environment for our students. So we are recommending that you and need to take action today before that nomination goes forward next month. We've laid that out in great detail in your board materials. And with that, I'm happy that we also have 3 employment agreements for the board to ratify. The first one is a position that reports to me. Vice President Mike Bertelson nomination after a national search. I believe he's very capable and able to carry out the duties of Vice President of University Services. Happy to take any questions from board members about that one. And then 2 other ones, actually, one is a president's appointment and one is a provost's request. So I'm happy to walk through the first 6 if there are any questions about any of the consent items up until the Vice President of Research appointment that President Kaler is bringing forward.
I would like to get the motion on the table if we could, and then we can talk about that. If
So move.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. The motion, and this motion is to take all of the consent items at once. Before we do that, President Kaler, did you want to say a word about the potential appointment of a vice president for research?
Thank you, Regent Anderson. I will take just 2 minutes to address this issue because we are seeking the committee's recommendation for full board approval of the appointment of Dr. Alan S. Levine as Vice President for Research for a 2-year period. So it's a term appointment beginning on Monday, if you approve it, and continuing through August 31st, 2019. I think many of you know Al. He's a person and a leader who perhaps needs no introduction, but I will briefly do so. Since January of 2017, Dr. Levine has held the position of interim head of the Office for Research, and in that period of time, he's earned the respect and trust of our faculty, the research community, and fellow members of my administration. And we're confident that he will continue to add collegiality and valuable direction as part of the senior leadership team. Near the end of what will be a 2-year appointment in 2019, we plan to reinitiate a national search for a new VP. We'll build upon listening sessions we've had already, as well as take input at that period of time. He has been just terrific in this interim role. He's provided exactly the kind of aligned leadership and vision that the community needs and that I need. He's been connected to the University of Minnesota since 1970 when he arrived on campus as a graduate student. He served as professor in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition, an adjunct in the Department of Psychiatry, most notably as Dean of the College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resource Sciences. He's also served as Vice Provost for Faculty and Academic Affairs. For 26 years, he was Associate Director of Research and a Senior Career Scientist at the Minneapolis VA Medical Center. He's pretty well qualified to do this. He oversees the university's $900 million research enterprise across all of our campuses and facilities, including administration of sponsored projects, research compliance, regulatory offices, and units dedicated to the economic development and technology commercialization missions of the institution. So it is with enthusiasm that I ask for your recommendation to the full board to the term appointment of Alan Levine as Vice President for Research at the University of Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you, President Kaler. Is there any other questions on the consent report prior to voting on it? Anybody have any questions on the consent? Regent Powell.
Thanks, Chair Anderson. Just a quick one for Senior Vice President Burnett. So a decline of the historical registration for that will be sufficient. There's no way that comes back at us. I support the proposal to decline that recognition, but I just want to understand that will resolve the issue.
Senior Vice President Burnett.
Not entirely, Regent Powell, Regent Anderson, thank you. We have to coordinate with the State Historic Preservation Office rather than consult, and while those words may seem similar, they're not. And so we've already been coordinating with the State Historic Preservation Office. We intend to continue to cooperate, but not change the programmatic approvals that this board has already made about where that project's going. So we're going to do all we can to maintain that historical integrity of the project, but the limitations that it places on us can't support it. So we will still coordinate with the state to a limit.
Regent Powell, you have a follow-up?
That's good. Thank you.
Regent Simmons?
I just want you to know I'm going to vote enthusiastically for this consent report, and particularly because of the 2 appointments that have been brought forward.
Thank you. Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. As someone who has been intimate with the Pioneer Hall project and chairing the Facilities Committee the last 2 years, I can say with a very clear conscience that this university is going above and beyond in its efforts to preserve the historical integrity of that facility, and indeed probably to the extent of spending considerably more money than we could have otherwise. So I harbor no reservations about that, and I enthusiastically support that as well. And Dr. Levine, I see if you'd added 1 more year to this, you would have had a 50-year term here. That's my economics background speaking, but very impressive, and thank you for your service.
Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I don't want to sound facetious in this question because I'm actually serious. We spend over $1 million in a 2-year period on toilet paper and paper towels.
Evidently.
Or is it just including toilet paper and paper towels, but there's other paper products?
Senior Vice President Burnett.
I think that's probably a fair assumption, Regent Omari. We can get details, but it's a big
The first one or the second one is that we just on those 2 items is over $1 million?
Yes, sir. I believe that's the information in front of us.
I'm always in favor of paper towels over the hand blow dryer.
I think this,
but now I don't know if I am anymore.
Sir, are you going to try to help us answer that question?
Yes,
Okay.
I can answer that question. There are 22 items on that RFP, and so it is more than paper towels and toilet paper. However, that is the lion's share of the items on the RFP.
Sir, for the record, could you identify yourself?
Yes, I am Mark Taragawa, and I'm the Director of U-Market Services, and we're the solutions provider that do the supply chain for the paper towels for U-Market.
Thank you.
No, Mr. Chair, I was just going to move to appoint a special task force chaired by Regent Omari. But we have our answers, so
okay.
I think
Regent Chu had a question. Regent Chu.
Just a follow-on question regarding the purchasing of these products. Do you do all the purchasing for the university, including all the auxiliaries and everything, or is it's just for part of the university?
Honorable Regent Chu and
yes, sir.
Chair Anderson. We do some of the purchasing, but only for supplies that run through U-Market Services. And so U-Market is the e-procurement engine at the university, and we work in collaboration with purchasing services. And they are the compliance arm. We are the supply chain arm. And so this particular supply chain is just for paper products, but we also have a few other supply items that are in a warehouse that is then managed by U-Market Services.
Thank you, sir. So we have the
Quick follow.
Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Is Delco Enterprises our current provider, and did we have other bids on this contract?
Yes, Regent Amare. The Delco Enterprises is our current, and there were 13 respondents to the RFP. And the RFP process went through a committee, and the respondents were weighed according to 5 different criteria, and Delco was the winner based on points.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. So as I said, we do have the consent resolution on the consent agenda resolution on the table. I'm going to ask for the vote at this time. All those in favor of accepting the consent report resolution signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. So before we get to the last items for Vice President Burnett, I was, I guess, lost at the beginning, and we had 2 new student representatives up here. And again, I'd like to give you a minute to introduce yourselves. To you, Student Representative Muller-Vennen, I believe, and Student Representative Chen. Do you want to give us a 1-minute biography of your life?
You can go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. My name is Sean Chen. I'm a PhD student in the chemistry department, 4th year, so my research focuses on chemical sensors. Beyond that, I've been involved with COGS before, Council of Graduate Students. That's the graduate student government body on the Twin City campus. So previously, I was the chemistry department's representative to the General Assembly of COGS. Later this year, I ran for election for this representative to the Board of Regents. If you remember, the previous chair of the student representatives is Lauren Mitchell, so she's now the chair of the COGS. COGS over the years has done a lot for the students, so I'm looking forward to working with everyone on the board. And thank you for this chance to introduce myself.
Likewise, we're looking forward to working with you. Ma'am?
Hello, my name is Apurva Muller-Vennen. I am a 3rd-year undergraduate student studying political science and global studies with a concentration in East Asia and human rights and justice. I am one of 2 reps to the Board of Regents from the Minnesota Student Association, which is the representative undergraduate student government for the Twin Cities. My other colleague is Mina. I've been involved in the Minnesota Student Association since I came here as a freshman, first as an intern, and then as an advocacy coordinator under our government and legislative affairs team. I additionally serve in a different capacity as an at-large representative in our congressional body of the Minnesota Student Association. And MSA has a lot of initiatives that we're working on this year, and I'm very excited for many of them, and I'm excited to see what I can bring to the board and working with you this year. Thank you.
Well, thank you, too, for choosing to be students at the University of Minnesota, and thank you for your service to this board. Thank you.
Thank you.
Vice President Burnett.
Just a couple of things on the information item to wrap up. And Regents, I'd ask you to, if you look at pages 139 and 140, we do have a couple information items. The most important, I think, to share with you is the recent bond sale that happened that you approved. And we were in New York last month, and we had a very successful day on Wall Street. And tremendous work by Carol Fleck, Mike Volna, the RBC team, and PFM, our consultants. We had told you when we talked about refinancing some of our debt and taking advantage of the call provisions that we were hoping for a $20 million net present value. We came back with $28.6 million net present value, and if you look at the information at the bottom of page 139 across the yield curve, we're talking about debt at less than 2.75%. And when we looked at all the bond issuances in the municipal bond market in the month of September, ours was as competitive with any issuers in the country, including institutions that are much larger than the University of Minnesota. So I just want to, my hat's off to the team and the folks that really continue to work to make our money work harder and to issue debt at the lowest possible price so that we can preserve our precious dollars for the program, the mission, the education of this institution. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to take any questions, but again, a shout out to the finance team for tremendous work last month.
Did you mention, I wasn't listening like I should have been, did you mention that over the life of those bonds, we will save approximately $28.6 million?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. At this point in time, I will take a motion for adjournment unless there's any other. Is there a second? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Adjourned.
Very good. Okay.
Not bad, Jason. Good to see you. All right. We haven't had to talk so long at the
Somebody who's going to be the lead, processing.